Hey everybody, welcome to the first science session of the conference. We're so excited to have you here and to learn about air-sea interactions from our wonderful lineup of speakers. This is a very brief introduction. I want most of the time to be for them. But this schematic here shows many of the different processes that we'll be talking about today. There's huge fluxes of matter, of energy across this air-sea interface. And the processes in the top of the ocean, the bottom of the atmosphere, are really important for controlling the biology, the chemistry, and the physics of the atmosphere and ocean. You'll hear all about that very soon. This cartoon itself is part of the U.S. SOLAS Science Plan, which is mentioned a little bit briefly in Heather's talk, and it's an offspring of the Ocean Atmosphere Interaction Committee. So I just want to spend a moment talking about that committee to really get you guys involved in it. So the Ocean Atmosphere Interaction Committee is a subcommittee of OCB. It's affiliated with SOLAS, which is the Surface Ocean Lower Atmosphere Study, which is an international initiative studying this boundary between the atmosphere and the ocean and all the processes that take place in it. The OAIC has a lot of members here. We have about 6 of us here. Can any of the OAIC members in the audience stand up so you can contact them this week? There's Bill, Dave, Yasser, Una, and me too. So there's quite a few of us here. So please come and talk to us this week. This session was proposed by OAIC, and we really want to get more members of sort of build community around air-sea interaction science. So say hello, tell us what you want. We have an old-fashioned shoebox that I put together with little Post-it notes if you want to give old-fashioned ideas, well, new ideas in an old-fashioned format. You can also email us to give us a more new format. This QR code brings us to our website where there is a link at the moment where you can join the listserv. And soon we're going to also add a little suggestion box to it, so you can give us suggestions of what you would like to do, or you can tell us in person. On Wednesday at lunch, still at this OCB meeting with the wonderful food, we're not going to take you away from that, but there are going to be some tables set up where if you're just do research at this air-sea interface or want to learn more about it or just talk to some cool people at lunch, come to those tables and join us. And finally, just in true sort of professor fashion, I know some people, there's going to be a discussion section at the end of this air-sea interaction session. And I know sometimes people like to see the questions before they read the textbook, wanting to know what they should be thinking about. So here are just some questions to think about during the talks today. One is, what are some ways to bridge gaps in our current understanding of air-sea interactions? How can we best integrate all this new material, the measurements, the process understanding, the new paradigms and models together to bridge these gaps and build understanding? And what are some important known uncertainties and how we can address them? So these will be the questions at the discussion at the end. Before that, we have 6 speakers. We have 10 lightning talks, a lot of opportunities for you to learn more. Thank you. Our first speaker is Kim Prather from USCB, who is going to be talking to us about sea spray aerosols, production controls, and air pollution impacts.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited just to meet. I'm going to meet I've read a lot of your work, but I haven't met many of you. So I hope to change that over the next week. And I hope I sort of set up this talk very broadly so that hopefully it'll inspire a lot of discussion, and future collaborations would be awesome because there's a lot of work to be done. Let's see. Okay, so I have been running a National Science Foundation Center for 14 years now, which is hard to believe. But basically, this is what's called the Center for Chemical Innovation. And our innovation was moving the ocean-atmosphere interface into the lab. And so our goal there was, I've been doing field studies for, 20 years before that. And you all know how that goes, been on ships, airplanes. And basically, we would, you take the weeks that are dealt to you and you make the best story you can, but you don't really control things. And so I like to control things. And so, so basically this is the team, and it has been an amazing team. Being a leader of this group has just literally changed my career, both personally and professionally. It's just been awesome. And I think I hear this common theme of how fun it is to work between, I'm an atmospheric chemist, but to work with oceanographers, marine biologists, data scientists. Gives me goosebumps just saying it. It's just the way to go, and it's what the world needs for us to solve the problems the big problems that we're in some ways making for ourselves, but facing. So the mission statement of CASE, the Center for Aerosol Impacts on Chemistry of the Environment, little story, it was Center for Aerosol Impacts on Climate and the Environment, but when a certain person got elected, we had to change it from climate to chemistry. So yeah, this is, as I say, it was 10 years of the main funding. It was $40 million, and in that, a big part of that was to move the ocean into the lab and really go after sort of decoupling the chemistry and the physics and the biology, or at least better understanding how each one plays a role and under which conditions one might be more important than the other. But ultimately, what is driving these processes across, causing transfer from the ocean to the atmosphere? Being an aerosol scientist, I was surprised that, you know, the oceans, I don't have to explain you the slide, but, you know, they cover such a massive part of our Earth. And from an aerosol perspective, I would say that the, you know, sea spray aerosols or just the aerosols in marine environments are perhaps the least understood of all. We tend to, you know, as scientists, we tend to spend a lot of time in sort of looking at air pollution. And so we've been sort of really going after, you know, what comes out of the ocean and how is the ocean influencing the composition of our atmosphere. With a strong focus, I should say, at the beginning, it was all about producing sea spray aerosols that look just like the ones out over the open ocean. Not just sodium chloride, not just, you know, reef salts or whatever, but actually capturing the biology that goes on in the ocean as well. And so to do that, I had to talk to my oceanography colleagues. I had to talk to Farouk Azam, many of you know, taught me about the microbial loop. I knew nothing. And he said, you know, atmospheric chemists, you always are so focused on the phytoplankton. And nothing against phytoplankton, but the bacteria are what really matter. And so they are what control, he convinced me, and ultimately we convinced ourselves that those bacteria are really important in controlling that composition of the ocean. In this case, this microbial loop gives us, as I read from, I think, people in this audience, up to 10 to the 15 different organic compounds. And so as a chemist, you know, trying to reproduce that complexity in the lab, there's no way we were going to be able to go just order the right chemicals in the right proportions from the Aldrich catalog. So we let, you know, these are our organic synthesis, sort of the organic chemists in our group. But basically, you know, getting this whole cycle to go was a big part of where we started. Where we actually started, and we spent 3 years getting it right, was working with oceanographers, Grant Dean and Dale Stokes. And, you know, they basically said, you atmospheric chemists are doing it all wrong. We just kept hearing we're doing it wrong, but, you know, that's okay. They helped us fix it. And so basically thinking about the bubbles. I love bubbles, and I've grown to really love bubbles. And so those bubbles are everything to this transfer process. And again, to this audience, I don't have to explain that, but we really, you know, just the scavenging, you know, sort of all the things we really, I was very interested in studying the heterogeneous chemistry that happens on the surface of particles. And if you don't do this part right, there's no chance. I mean, you'll study chemistry, but it will have nothing to do with the outside world. And our goal was to really be able to bridge the field and lab studies by doing this. So a little surprise, we spent, you know, so much time focusing on the sea spray, but ultimately these gases, and I said, you know, there's just a lot of gases coming out because we just put a lid, as you'll see, on top of the ocean. So we don't have a reactive, you know, atmosphere above. So they can come out and they just sit there and we measure them. And there's thousands of gases coming out of this ocean. And when I first said this, people laughed. They literally laughed, like, oh, you just mean DMS. No, not just DMS. Like there's thousands of peaks in our mass spectra. So I have kind of moved over my own research program more towards looking at these gases that are coming out. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'm happy to have conversations about that through this week. So once we had the starting material, as I say, it took 3 years to get there. Now we can start thinking about reactions. What happens when, you know, you turn on the lights? What happens when you add oxidants? And so we can start looking at sort of the transformations that occur in this system. The other thing we're interested in case, you know, from sort of how do we produce it, how do we transform it, and then how does that affect water uptake? Very, very interested in cloud seeding. And so, you know, basically, you know, thinking about the reactions and how those reactions affect the water uptake at the surface of the ocean, as well as the surface of the particles. One thing I want to say is, again, my focus was initially very much on heterogeneous chemistry and thinking about that's the model of what a sea spray particle looks like, right? It's got this little salt core and it's got this perfectly ordered surfactant around it that's supposed to turn off the reactions, but that's not what we see. We see that sea spray is incredibly reactive and changes really fast. And so we modeled this using actually biological tools. This is a billion atom simulation of one sea spray particle. And what you see is sort of all the little, this is by Romeo Morrow, but basically you see all the little rafts that form. It's like the surface of the ocean. It mimics that, no surprise. But we can actually see that it's pretty wide open for reaction. And so this better explains the observations. And this made me feel good because, we went into all this work to get it produced correctly. Did it matter? And the answer was yes. So, bubbles, aerosolization. And now, I used to have to explain what aerosols are, except COVID came and I don't have to explain aerosols anymore. And so, I guess that's one of the silver linings. But, thinking about aerosolization, how do you produce sea spray? This is a wave in SOARs, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think you'll hear more about these different mechanisms, and I think most people in this audience have seen these different mechanisms that take place. It took us a while to get it right. We use acoustics, we do photographs, we actually count these bubbles, and we were able to show that the bubbles we produce look just like those of a breaking wave in the open ocean. And so when you get it right, you start to see really interesting, very interesting structures. There's a bacteria with a phage going into it, little sea spray droplet with a bacterium, you kind of see it buried in there, and then these cute little sort of cellular-like structures. And that was pretty exciting when we started to see these things appearing once we got this process right. So where we started was just a straight 33-meter long wave channel where we pumped the seawater straight in, and that's one of Farouk's images. But we can induce biology, and we have lights, and so we can actually, cause this biology to happen and track that biology over time. And as you see from the fluorescence images, it gets messier and messier as you go. And so the big question we had was, what gets out? Okay, that's what's in the water, but what is making it into the air? And that's a big focus, has been a big focus of our research over the past 14 years. Feels weird to say that. Fast forward, we now have SOARs, and anybody who wants to visit SOARs, anybody who wants to come do research in SOARs, this is an advertisement for SOARs. It is amazing now that it works. It was a pain in the, anyway, we won't go there. It didn't work so well when it started. It broke, it ate itself, but we redesigned it and rebuilt it, and now we have, as of a few days ago, we now have over 100-mile-per-hour winds that we can get in this system. So we've got breaking waves, we can control the amplitude, which is my oceanography. I'm like, why are we doing the amplitude? I shouldn't display my ignorance, but I'll tell you anyway. We can control the amplitude, which they're like, that's how you tweak the white cap coverage. And so we're able to do that really, really well. It turns out that we can control the temperature of the air, the temperature of the water. We can, it's now, instead of 3,600 gallons of seawater, it's 36,000 gallons of seawater. And it has an integrated smog chamber, an observation room, as you see. And basically, it gives us, and we can make sea ice. And so we actually can get the temperatures down really low and look at sea ice dynamics as well. And again, I think it's just, it was hard to get it to run, but now it works. And having done field studies, it can be hard, but it's like doing a field study in the lab, except you control. You can make a change and then watch the response. And so we've learned, every time we turn it on, we learn something new. And so this is just the observation room, a couple of my students working in there, and you can see the beautiful waves that are breaking. And what I'm going to focus on today is this transfer across the surface, but really focused on the microbes themselves, the viruses and the bacteria, just to give you a flavor for what this system looks like. Those of you who haven't visited Scripps, this is a hydraulics lab, which has been there for a long time, but it basically has SOARs to give you a feel for the magnitude. There's breaking waves, look quick, they're under there with the lid on. And then you come around, there's all of our instruments. There's Keela, she's here, so I don't know where Keela is, but basically this is my whole group. It's just, it's like moving the real world into the lab. And so, I would love to, there's the waves, the magical waves. And again, anybody who's around, wants to visit, wants to do research together, please let us know, because we built it to share with the community. All right, so first thing we did when we got it going, and it didn't seem like, people were like, how much sea spray is produced? What controls how much sea spray comes out of the ocean, as you vary wind? You see the plots, from Schwartz and Lewis and all these measurements that have been done, and it's got, like sometimes 7 orders of magnitude variability. So what is leading to that variability? So the first thing we did was we said, let's just vary wind speed and see what happens. So this is size of sea spray aerosols. And we basically can just dial up the wind speed. It's, you know, kind of nice. And so you watch it just start marching up, as you would expect. But when you have a system that's this complex, sometimes you get surprises. So we dialed it just a little bit more, and suddenly it just went exponentially off. And so now, you know, we're realizing there's extra mechanisms that are kicking in. And so we're having to figure out, you know, why do you get, that's the same sort of linear change in wind speed, and it just goes off. So this is a little tease for you, and I'd love to have people, you know, talk to people about that this week. That's wind. What about temperature? All right, here we go again. Sea spray size of distribution, and basically we start at 20 degrees, and then we cool it down to 2 degrees. Does anybody want to guess whether you get more or less sea spray when you cool it? Don't all speak at once. Ooh, I hear a little bit of the right answer. You ready? I'm just going to jump to 2. Let's just, you can see kind of how I plotted it. I might have given you a hint. There you go, a lot more. And does anybody want to guess why? Not explained by viscosity. It's probably part of it, but we think, right now our hypothesis is that you're actually changing the chemistry of the water and making more gels. And we have a lot of reasons for that, but we think that maybe it's not salts that are coming out. It's not all of a sudden you just magically start getting, which didn't really make sense at the time, but actually we believe that you're actually starting to get more of the organic, these organic gel-like particles, and we're exploring that now. And again, I would love to talk to people. This was one of those eye-openers where after all the work to get this built, it felt like, okay, yeah, this is something you just could not probably figure out very well in the field, but there are observations in the field where they've been like, why are, in the Arctic, for example, why are we seeing more CCN? And so the cool thing is that you just put the water in, and we filter it. I should add that. We've been filtering the heck out of the water so that we turn off as much of the biology. Now, the chemistry that's there from the biology, we can't get rid of. So we're really trying to get, once you turn on the biology, things just go wonky. Like bio takes over. I vowed about, you know, bio is everything. But it's led to the chemistry, but now we'll start turning on the biology as we go forward. But we can just dial, this is one of, she saw these data, and that's what I look like too. And so, yeah, it's incredible, because if you just dial it, you just do this month after month, year after year, you get the same answer. So we're pretty excited, and she's very excited, and she's a future scientist. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears, because they wanted me to talk about sort of both sides of what we're doing. And what CASE has done is set the stage for us looking in the real world to see if we're just, you know, making stuff up in the lab or if it's really what's happening. So Imperial Beach, how many of you, anybody heard? Imperial Beach is in southern San Diego. And how many people have heard of Imperial Beach? Billions of gallons of raw sewage pour into that ocean. Yum. And so it's been declared a state of emergency. The beach is closed. These are bacterial, based on bacterial levels. As you get down close to the border, beaches are pretty much closed all the time. And basically, surfers can't go in. People don't go to the beach. People there are very angry because this has been going on for decades. So multiple generations of their family can't go to the beach. So they're really unhappy. So this has become a massive project, a massive community project for us. And we're working with the community. What I like to say is, you know, when you shut down the beach, you tell people not to swim or go drink the water, but you don't tell people not to breathe. And so we've been thinking about it from the air perspective, and it's gained a lot of attention. And it's in a good way, I think, because right after we published this paper I'll talk about in a second, you know, suddenly people from further away cared, because air travels much further than, you know, a lot of people had the attitude, oh, I don't go to that beach, so, you know, but when they realized that they were living in a fancy house on a cliff and they're breathing some of that air, then they started to pay attention. This is an article that just came out where I pointed out, you know, we breathe 11,000 liters of air a day versus drink 2 liters of water, and we filter that water. And so why are we ignoring the air like we are? This is a region, you can see it's right down at the Mexican border. There's a wastewater treatment facility on actually both sides. It's failing. When it rains, it really fails. And so you can see it just kind of goes into the ocean. This is a little bit more, you can see the river, the Tijuana River is what's dumping into there. This is the Imperial Beach Pier. This is the core of the team. There's a lot more people involved now, sort of setting up to do the air sampling that we're doing down there. So thinking about CASE on the left is what CASE set up for us. we think we understand sort of the normal ocean. But what happens when you start being where people are? You start to just see a lot more pollution go into that water. And which things are we actually starting to see make it into the air is a big question. As you've seen during COVID, there's a lot of sewage surveillance, right? Wastewater surveillance. Everything's in there, right? And so everything's in here. And so how far will it travel? Does it affect human health, crop health, ecosystem health? These are all questions that we have. So thinking about, sort of this paper really was the one that Matt, one of my students that graduated recently, published, but basically looking at the air, we have them just on plates, like a simple way at first, but we're also doing a lot more sequencing. But basically through the sequencing, we were able to show that up to 76% of the bacteria you breathe in the air at Imperial Beach can be traced right back to that river, like contact tracing. And so that alarmed a lot of people. And so not just the bacteria and the viruses, but also the chemicals. So we're seeing more in the water leads to more in the air, not a huge surprise. And these are all the common products, including various drugs. And so it's a problem that for some reason nobody thought about, and it's not just a problem limited to Imperial Beach. It's a global problem. Everybody dumps their sewage in the water. And so, thinking forward, we started sequencing things. We've moved ahead. We've collected many different samples. Lisa Ziegler is a collaborator on the bio side. Miley Heyer is the student that's been working on this project. These are sort of the standard tools we're using for the sequencing, but I just want to highlight the work that we've done with the qubit to sort of just look at total DNA in the air. And we had a huge surprise when we did that. This is what's called transboundary flow. So it's the amount of water coming across the US-Mexican border. Each spike is a huge rain event, basically. And so what you see is after every rain event, we get a spike of water, more water pumping across, which means more of this pollution going into the ocean. And amazingly, the DNA, which are the red dots, track pretty nicely, slight lag. But to link DNA in the air to what was in the water, or to the water flow, this was a pretty big but a pleasant surprise to see such a strong correlation. But again, we could be suspicious and say, are we sure? So we looked at the RNA as well. That's the bottom. Those are the blue dots. And again, same thing. And so this flow is driving the biology that we're seeing in the air. And these are the different samples that we see. Some days are really disgusting, but the days that are the clearest are actually the days that are the most, that are often have the most biology on them because they're just coming straight off the ocean. Big surprise, we found intact phage in the air. And so with their little tails still attached, which indicates that they're probably still active. And so we're thinking about things like horizontal gene transfer and other things that these phage could be doing. We see all different types. And, to our knowledge, this is the first time phage, intact especially, has been detected in the air. So there's lots of questions that come about from that. I'm almost there. Okay. So the big one, which I could have given a whole talk about, is what do we do now? What does it mean to be breathing this cocktail of everything? I didn't even talk about the metals. And so, we're looking at the impacts on antibiotic resistance, which we believe it's probably significant. Now people, MDs at first, doctors thought I was a little crazy, but it's not the first time, but it's okay. I take that as a challenge. And so I'm getting contacted by doctors with we see this correlation. The best correlation was with sodium chloride to early birth and low birth weight in the coastal zone. Why is sodium chloride, is there other stuff there? Well, yeah, there's a little bit of other stuff there. So there's a lot of really cool things we're doing. We're making lung organoids and gut organoids, royal we, and then we expose it to these samples. And so we're trying all these different paths to see what does it really mean to have this stuff in the air and have it being breathed. We put mimics for things like cholera. So Rita Caldwell is now involved. And, it's, sort of a surrogate for that, it's transferred incredibly efficiently. Only about 20% of the things are transferred really well, and we're trying to understand that now. So we've launched a new institute, which is kind of a spinoff, part of CASE, but it's more after the health part with my colleague Romeo Morrow. Quickly, I'll just say I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for an amazing team that's working really, really hard on all these different projects. They're an inspiration, and we're trying to get as many students as we can trained because this is really cutting across different fields. And if people are interested in joining us, please talk to me at this meeting. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for your attention. And again, I'm really excited to talk to people this week. So thank you very much.
We have time for questions.
Great talk. Thank you so much, Suzanne Craig, Nessa Goddard. I probably need to talk to you over coffee, but do you have a kind of core suite of VOCs that you would recommend sampling for?
We're working on that. Basically we, I'll just tell you some of the bigger, I don't know if I'd say surprises, but, as I say, everybody focuses on DMS, right? So we're starting to see things like, DMDS, DMTS. We see methaneethiol a lot more than you would think.
Yep.
DMS isn't always there. Beta pinene. I mean, I can go through the list. What's weird is there's a few big ones,
yep.
And then you just look in high-res mass spec, and there's just peaks at every mass. It's like 1,000 peaks. Yeah.
We've actually seen compounds that are traditionally associated with anthropogenic processes, and they're biological. So I'd love to have coffee with you.
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. I think Luke back.
Thanks a lot. Luke Tiger from Princeton. Thanks a lot, Kim. It's really great as usual. When you show the temperature dependency, it's the water temperature. What about the air temperature?
Oh, let's see. We controlled that too. So we were trying to keep it the same. But basically we try to keep, as I say, that we try, but I haven't looked at the actual output of those data, but, basically it's just sitting there, parked for a long time. And so especially when we get down, it's hard to drive it down, but once it's down, the air and the water get pretty stable. And then it, going back up turns out to be obviously much easier. But I can't remember. I have to look at that's a good question, because I haven't looked at the output of the sensors, but again, we were purposely trying to get to lower it as well, and we have that capability.
So I'd just like to introduce our next speaker, Douglas Hamilton, coming up from North Carolina State University, and the really great title here, Can Fire and Water Mix to Create Life? So Douglas, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay. Great, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk today. I'm an atmospheric scientist, so it's really wonderful to come and interact with the ocean biogeochemistry people, come and talk about the role of aerosols and what we're doing from the atmosphere side, and hopefully that will lead to some great collaborations. This is my first time at OCB, so I am doubly excited to be here today. So today's talk, what I want to talk about is the role of wildfires in regulating ocean biogeochemical cycles. I'm going to give some case studies of my own work, but also work of other people in the field as well. So just to say thank you to everybody who's worked with me, past, present, and hopefully some of you in the future as well. It's been a really, really wonderful journey trying to thinking about the ways in which fires really do connect the land and the atmosphere. We've heard a little bit about that today. And one of the things I really like about fires is this lens that they provide into interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work. They really do help us think about the way in which the world is working, and they're connecting all of these different Earth system spheres. And hopefully by the end of today's talk, you'll also be as excited about this topic as I am. So just quickly, this is a biogeochemical cycle and climate cycle with the role of aerosols placed within it. I'm going to use that just as a quick guide of what I want to talk about today. So first of all, starting in the top here, I'm going to talk a little bit about nutrient aerosols, and particularly those from wildfires, the impact of wildfires potentially on ecosystem fertility, and then potentially some of the impacts that I might have for the carbon cycle. But as we've just heard in that wonderful talk from Kim as well, that although my story ends here, the story itself continues, which is a lot of what Kim was talking about, which is that the production or increase in productivity as a result of potentially this fertilization effect, we get then feedbacks onto the atmosphere, so you get aerosols which can be released into the atmosphere. They can alter climate through cloud processes, things like changing precipitation or temperature. Those changes in climate and weather variables can then feed back onto the land surface processes. And if we're thinking about fires, it can alter things like fuel availability or fuel moisture. So therefore, the story goes on, although I'm going to stop today at the point of the aerosols being deposited to the atmosphere. So I like to always start any talk about aerosols with this wonderful animation from NASA. It really helps to give that kind of global view of what we're talking about when we're saying just aerosols. Aerosols are not just one thing. They come from a wide variety of different sources, and that's what we're looking at here. In orange, what you'll see is the dust aerosols. That's really coming out of that dust belt, particularly from northern Africa. In the blue, what we're seeing is the sea spray aerosols, which are coming out alongside those wind tracks, as we've just heard, very, very sensitive to that wind speed. So you're seeing large production of sea spray aerosols where wind speeds are at their highest. In pink, we're looking at pollution aerosols. But for today's talk, I want to draw your eye to the red, and that's the places where the wildfire aerosols are coming from. And in particular, just watch the southeast coast of Australia, because this particular animation is capturing the 2019-2020 mega fire in Australia, which was unprecedented in its scale. And you'll start to see some of that aerosol plume coming out just hopefully about now. But one of the things that we can see when we look at this kind of global view of aerosols is that aerosols in the atmosphere are highly spatially and temporally heterogeneous, okay? The sources of aerosols are very, very different depending on where you are in the world, and that's to do with the very short lifetime of aerosols in the atmosphere, from a couple of days up to just a couple of weeks. So when we're thinking about their impacts on different ocean basins, the different sources of aerosols become very, very important, because each different upwind area from a different basin is going to be receiving aerosols from different places with different sources and different physiochemical characteristics. So what is it about the characteristics of wildfire aerosols then that make it interesting for us to study in terms of biogeochemical cycles? What we're looking at here, we've got a nice schematic which is showing the evolution of a landscape under a fire from the fire starting here at seconds to minutes through to the fire ceasing, at which time, if you've had a very large fire, you can have removal of the vegetation, so you have a post-burn landscape all the way through to potentially months or even years for the biome to recover from itself. So we have the fire, and within the fire, we have the consumption of the biomass, which is producing that black smoke that we see. But also within that fire, and there's a lot of heat, so pyroconvection is generating massive amounts of energy, and that's actually sucking up the soils from the local environment as well. So we end up with a plume, which is actually a dynamic mixture of the consumption of the biomass as well as the entrained soils from that local environment. And then when we investigate what's in that plume, we find that on top of the carbonaceous aerosols that you might expect, we find a whole mixture, a whole cocktail of other things, including nitrogen, iron, and phosphorus, which I want to focus on today. But the story doesn't end there, because if you have removed the vegetation from the landscape, then you've got a bare erodible surface, which is then susceptible to dust emissions until that landscape itself reforms back to vegetation. So we have this legacy effect of increased dust emissions potentially from that post-burn landscape. So even though the fire is finished, we may still be altering atmospheric chemistry. And in fact, a recent study from UNGNU placed 1 in 2 large fires will experience this large increase in dust emissions afterwards. And I want you to remember that, because that becomes important later on in one of the case studies. Okay, so where are fires? Where does fire emissions come from? What we're looking at here is just a satellite view of global burnt area, and what you can see in general is that most fires in the world are coming from the tropics. They're coming from savanna grasslands, which are burning every year, particularly in Africa. But the forested regions of the world, particularly boreal forest regions of the world, also have significant fires too. When we're creating, and when the satellite data people are looking at these emissions, they're creating their data sets, they're mainly focused on the carbonaceous aerosols, which is not necessarily what we're interested in when we're thinking about the biogeochemistry. So what we can do is we can look to a range of aircraft campaigns which have measured carbon in the smoke over different fire regions, over different biomes around the world, and those places where they've also measured iron and phosphorus. And then we can relate the amount of carbon which is in the plume to these different nutrients to try and get a handle on how much iron or phosphorus or other particular trace elements we may be interested in. And then we can use that information in our global climate models to predict the transport of these trace elements. One of the other things that we can do is we can have a look at the iron to aluminium ratio, and that was interesting to do because what that can do is it can give us a little bit of a handle on this difference between how much of the iron that we're seeing in the dust plume is coming from the biomass consumed compared to how much might be coming from that soils and trains. And that's an important question, which we really still don't know very much about because the chemical composition or characteristics of these two different sources are likely to be very, very different. So what we do is we had a look at the aluminium to iron ratio across 16 different aircraft campaigns. And what we found is that on average, we found a 0.6 to 1 ratio of iron to aluminium. And if we compare that to what the global crustal content is, about 0.44 to 1, then we end up with this enrichment factor of about a third coming from the biomass and 2/3 of it coming from the soils. This is very important because it means it's suggesting that the large concentrations, the largest component of the iron in the smoke plumes that's being transported around the world is actually coming from the soils. That's likely to say have a very different chemical composition to that which is being consumed. We know very, very little about this at the moment. Okay, so in relation to other aerosol sources, how much is fire contributing to the atmosphere? Here what we're looking at is a ternary diagram. In the yellow, we have the dust sources. In blue, we have other different types of sources. And in red, we have what I'm classing as pyrogenic sources, which is a combination of fire as well as anthropogenic sources. And this can give us an idea of the relative contribution of fires compared to other aerosol sources. If we have a look here at TN, total nitrogen, we can see that that is very much dominated by these pyrogenic sources. The vast majority of the nitrogen which is getting into the atmosphere is in fact coming from pyrogenic sources. However, conversely, if we have a look at the total amount of iron or the total amount of phosphorus which is being released to the atmosphere, that's being dominated by dust sources, those mineral sources. But it's not that total amount that we care about in terms of the biogeochemistry, it's the bioavailable fraction, or what we call, from the atmosphere side of things, the soluble fraction. And when we look at the soluble contribution of iron and the soluble contribution to phosphorus, we see that in fact other sources then become equally as important as dust, or in fact actually in some regions, some ocean deposition regions, it may be that fires are actually the dominant source of that deposition to those ocean regions. So when we're thinking about soluble phosphorus and soluble iron, it's important to think about these other sources and in particular fires beyond dust, going beyond the question of dust, which is what a lot of the community has been thinking about for a long time, to start considering these other sources and what the impacts they may have. So in talking about impacts, I want to just go through 3 quick case studies with you, one for nitrogen, one for phosphorus, and one for iron, of the role of wildfires in providing these nutrients to different regions of the world, and potentially the ecological biogeochemical response to it. And here I'm just placing, for each of them, a nutrient limitation map, just to give you an idea of what nutrient we'll be talking about, and a little cross here of where the study was looking at. So this first one for the Arctic, we were approached by oceanographers working at Stanford, and they had noticed an extreme phytoplankton bloom in the Laptev Sea here, really close to where the sea ice was melting in the summer of 2014. So they've had a look through all of the different variables that could be contributing to this plume in terms of the ocean, and they couldn't find anything. There was nothing there which would be providing the nitrogen to support this plume. So they come to us as atmospheric scientists and saying, hey, could it possibly be the atmosphere? And I love that kind of question because it's like, okay, well, let's have a look and let's see what's going on. And then my first question is, I hope this has something to do with fires. And yes, it does turn out that it was. So dust downwind of this, so here's a back trajectory. The fire is here, back trajectory, just downwind of the phytoplankton bloom. There was a very, very large fire in that summer. And this is showing the anomaly of the nitrogen emissions. And here we've got the nitrogen deposition in the total amount against the anomaly here on the right-hand side. But really, the numbers don't matter. I just want you to take away the impression that there was a large amount of nitrogen being produced by that fire, which was being deposited into the correct place. So we then looked at modeling. We tried to work out how much nitrogen was being deposited to the ocean, and we worked out that the forest fire could be contributing maybe about 25% to the 33% of the nitrogen that would be required by the phytoplankton bloom. The question then was, well, where's the rest coming from? Coming from the oceans. We've had a look at the forest fires. Is there another source of nitrogen that we're missing? There was a little bit of a clue in my initial schematic here, when we're thinking about fires, we often think about this. We often think about the forest, which is burning in this really big, large black smoke plume. However, that's not the only type of fire that exists on Earth, and particularly in the boreal regions, we have a lot of peat. The peat is defrosting, it's thawing, and this peat has been accumulating massive amounts of carbon and nitrogen over millennia, and that's this here. So it's a lot lower temperature in terms of the fire, but it's releasing a significant amount of nitrogen. So when we went back and had to look at our fire inventories, we realized that that peat source was actually missing in our original estimates. So we then added that in, and what we found is if we account from peat fires, then we actually can close the budget. So the amount of nitrogen which was coming from the peat was of a sufficient amount, up to 2.5 times more than what was coming from the forest fires, and then that was enough to then support this phytoplankton bloom. And that opens all sorts of questions for the future climate of the Arctic region as those peat regions are thawing and as that nitrogen is being released to the atmosphere. What does that mean for the biogeochemistry of the region? Okay, I want to move on to phosphorus next. This will be a very, very quick discussion. And this study again came from observationists who had discovered a very large amount of phosphorus. This time they had measured it in French Guiana down here in Cayenne. And what they found here for this study is that traditionally the thought was that phosphorus is transported across the Atlantic Ocean from the dust sources. And yes, that is true, in fact, in the spring. But when we look to the fall, that actually the transport pathways are coming more from southern Africa and are coming from this combustion source. What's happening is that you have the location of the ITCZ, which is basically a rain belt. You can think about it, and it's a barrier to transport. And that moves up and down. And in the fall, it actually stops the transport of dust coming from the north, but then the fires become this dominant source. So we modeled this. We were interested in seeing what it looked like in the model. And we were absolutely, I have to say, gobsmacked to find out that the only way that we could reach the number that was being measured was to take our original assumptions of what we thought we knew about how much phosphorus was in these fires and multiply it by a factor of 60. We were absolutely way off the mark. So this really highlights that we know very little, I think, about how much phosphorus is in fires, and a lot more work needs to be done on this source. Finally, I want to finish up today's talk, finish up today's case studies talking about the role of iron. And this one from this quite famous, I think now, study where we're looking at the large phytoplankton bloom, which was generated by the wildfire in southern Australia. So the fire itself was devastating, cannot be underestimated, really, the absolutely catastrophic impact of that fire. Over 20% of the forest was actually consumed within this fire. We can see massive smoke plumes from the satellites and smoke being transported all the way out over the Southern Ocean and the South Pacific. And so what the authors of this study did is then they looked at the chlorophyll anomalies for that year, for that summer, in relation to that smoke deposition. And what they found was that the phytoplankton bloom, if you integrate over that area, that size of that phytoplankton bloom was the same size as Australia itself. Absolutely massive. And they translated that into changes in net primary productivity. And what they found is that for this year, there was about 20% more net primary productivity in the region compared to the climatological mean. Same for the export potential, the carbon export, there's about 20% more that year compared to the climatological mean. But this, I think, is the really tantalizing part, and I would love to talk to anybody here today about this, or over the course of the week, that when they looked at how much carbon would have been sequestered over the full time length of that bloom, they found that it was of an equal and opposite magnitude to the amount of carbon which was released by the fire. Now, there's a lot of assumptions in here, and I think there's a lot that we need to learn. But if this is true, it really changes the way in which we should be thinking about the carbon cycle and the way we should be thinking about the role of fires in that. Because if this is net zero, then what happens when the forests start growing back? That's another carbon sequestration, which is beyond this. And that is not the way in which we're thinking about the carbon cycle at the moment. The other really interesting thing, I think, to think about for this particular phytoplankton bloom as well is its length, its duration. That lasted 9 months, up to 9 months. That's a very long time for phytoplankton bloom, well beyond the time in which the fire itself was actually occurring. So why might it last that long? The authors here, Weiss et al., had a look at that, and what they suggested is it was the size of the bloom. It was so large, it was the size of Australia, and that it was really efficient recycling of the nutrients within that bloom, and the diffusion and loss of the nutrients was very small. So all it required was small top-ups. Where might you be getting those small top-ups? Well, here we come back to this legacy of impact of the wildfires. That dust now, which is being able to be released from those bare erodible soils, is actually being able to top up that bloom. So not only did the fire potentially start the bloom, its legacy impact was able to sustain it over its duration. So that opens up questions, I then think, for what about the future? I think everybody here is probably reading the media all the time and seeing that there's a larger fire every single year than there was from the year before. It's not a question of if, it's more of a question of where that large fire is now going to occur. So what does that mean for the future of biogeochemical cycles and fires? We did a modeling study where we had a look at the change in fires over this century, and we followed the RCP 4.5 scenario. For anybody who doesn't know, that just means it's a medium, middle of the road kind of climate warming, not too extreme or not too low. And we had to look at the change in soluble iron deposition fluxes to the oceans from 3 different sources which might be susceptible to either climate change or changing anthropogenic activity: dust, fires, and anthropogenic sources themselves. We found that dust didn't change very much. Anthropogenic changed very little, and in actual fact, the vast majority of the changes that we're seeing over the course of the century are coming from the increasing wildfire activity. And that's what you're looking at here. These big increases of potentially up to 80% more iron being deposited, particularly to the southern hemisphere, is coming from increased fire activity in these simulations. So we thought, okay, let's run that in a biogeochemistry model, and let's have a look at the impacts. We can compare the future to the present day and have a look at what that might mean for net primary productivity, community composition, and then getting to this idea of carbon export. And we can see that, yes, there may well be changes in primary productivity, although they are much, much smaller than the changes in the deposition flux. But what was most interesting about this was this shifting of the community. The community composition within the model was shifting away from small phytoplankton towards larger diatoms in the model. So that meant that the carbon export was much, much more efficient. And we're seeing here numbers, particularly in the South Pacific region, of potentially up to 20%. And that was the same number, if you remember, that Tang et al. Had actually got for their large extreme event. That opens up the question of, is what we're seeing now as extreme events actually going to become more of the norm in the future? And what does the carbon cycle response to that increase in fires mean? My final statistic for you is that in doing that, what we actually found, we can break down then the carbon export efficiency of fires compared to other sources. And just in comparison to dust, the one which aerosol source which received a lot of attention, when we do this, we found that the carbon export efficiency, so that's per gram of carbon exported, per gram of soluble iron which is deposited to the ocean, is potentially 9 times more efficient than dust. 9 times, almost an order of magnitude more efficient in the model. So we need to really characterize this. We really need to understand what the future of fires may mean for the global carbon cycle. So thanks very much. Here's my summary slide, which is... Perfect. Nitrogen to the Arctic, iron to the Southern Ocean, and potentially phosphorus as well. Thank you.
Hi, Katsumi Matsumoto from NSF. Wonderful talk. Have you looked at the downstream effect of iron fertilization? Because you said that extra iron from wildfires will boost production, but the macronutrients that would have been transported downstream from, say, Southern Ocean to oh, you have something. Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you look at the equatorial Pacific region, if you were being very eagle-eyed there, you would see that, yes, there is, in fact, a fertilization effect along the upwelling, but then the macronutrients are being taken up and used. So as the lateral kind of evection of those nutrients are going out, it means there's less nitrogen, less phosphorus. So when you start to integrate over basin scale, it can end up with different changes. And then what we end up seeing is because of that, and if we look over time, we can actually end up with differences in the limitation patterns to the ocean. So this increasing, which is basically being driven here by the fires, in the future we may see reductions in iron limitation regions, and that's these, the regions here, which are kind of crossed out, and you're either moving towards nitrogen limitation or phosphorus limitation, depending on whether the cross is in a purple or kind of a pinky color for different community groups. So yes, that's true very much for the Equatorial Pacific and a little bit for the North Pacific. And for the Southern Ocean, we don't see that. It's much more of a solid one-way response as compared to seeing that loss over time. So yes, very, very important to consider for the Equatorial Pacific.
I think I have the next question. I'm Bill Miller from the University of Georgia. Hello, Douglas. That was beautiful. How does the model define export? Say it's 9 times. What's the time frame of that? Is it to the deep ocean? Is it what does export actually mean in your model?
Yeah, so it's the amount of carbon which is lost out of the euphotic zone. So the residence time of that carbon, and whether it goes to the deep ocean or whether it comes back up later, we do not look at here. We're just looking at that export out of the euphotic zone.
So our next talk is from Yassir Edibar from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. We have some representation from Scripps here today. So he's going to talk about the aerosol impacts on ocean biogeochemistry, an indirect role via the climate and air-sea interactions.
Thank you. Everyone can hear me okay? Great. So thanks again for the committee and for everyone who's organizing this meeting. This is my first meeting as well here. It's really exciting. I want to acknowledge computational support and funding from NSF for some of the work that I'll be sharing here. Today I want to talk about aerosols' impacts on biogeochemistry, but I thought I will start us off with the big picture. This is the Keeling curve, which many of you are familiar with. We're especially familiar with the long-term increase in carbon dioxide, as well as the seasonal cycle in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, both induced by anthropogenic emissions and exchanges with the ocean and land with the atmosphere. But there's some much more interesting and nuanced signals in this curve, mostly on interannual timescales. And a really subtle feature here is there's a pause in the Keeling curve, right around 92, 93. And that pause, when it was first reported by Dave Keeling, was making these measurements, prompted a community discussion about what could possibly be causing the Keeling curve to stop for a couple of years. So that's a pretty major signal. This paper by Jorge Sarmiento, this article sort of summarized the community discussion back in '93 about what could be possibly driving that. This pause coincided with the Pinatubo eruption of '91. And consensus was that the eruption led to a change in the air-sea flux of carbon, both by land and the ocean, but it wasn't very clear how much of that was driven by land and how much was driven by the ocean. And it catalyzed a bunch of really interesting research on how land and ocean carbon sinks respond to climate perturbations, both warming and cooling. I highly recommend going back to this article because it really brings up a lot of really interesting questions. This is an ocean-atmosphere interaction session, so I'll talk also about an ocean tracer, oxygen. A great deal of research has been going on the last couple decades on how oxygen is changing due to global warming. We expect that oxygen will decline as the ocean warms and stratifies. And the most recent synthesis of the oxygen global inventory shows a general decline in oxygen, but there's a substantial amount of variability from interannual to decadal timescales. You'll see, for example, right after 1980, there's a large increase. Then right after 91, there's a flattening or an increase, then the 2000s. And much of the conversation about this variability has been linked to internally generated variability, climate variability associated with modes like El Nino southern oscillations, the Pacific decadal oscillations. Here's some work by Curtis Deutsch that attributes the decadal variability in oxygen along the California current system to the Pacific decadal oscillation, essentially the shoaling of the thermocline driving changes in nutrient supply to the surface and driving variability in oxygen consumption along with the isopycnal heave. However, we haven't really talked about aerosol effects on these budgets, both oxygen and carbon budgets, in great detail. So the question, not just for today, but for the community is what role do aerosols play in driving variability in global ocean carbon oxygen budgets? We heard this just right before me, the wonderful talk by Douglas on the role of fires in driving plankton blooms and changes in biogeochemistry. And that's one of the effects of aerosols, which I call direct effect via atmospheric deposition of nitrogen, iron, and phosphorus. That can lead to fertilizing production, carbon export, but also potentially oxygen consumption at depth as that carbon is exported to depth and is remineralized. But a less explored effect on biogeochemistry is an indirect effect via aerosol changes on the climate system and air-sea interactions, and that can be induced both by changes in gas solubility via the SST cooling. This is the phenomenon that we're more familiar with, but also nonlinear dynamical responses in the climate system associated with changes in modes of variability, changes in ventilation intensity, and changes in large-scale circulation as well. So that's far less understood. So today, I'll just talk about two of these examples. I'll take an example from natural sources of aerosols, volcanic eruptions, and also an anthropogenic source of aerosols from fossil fuels burning and biomass burning. Noting that there's a lot of different sources of aerosols that I haven't even put into this slide. Sea spray effects, for example, and their indirect effects on clouds. But today I'll share some work using some recent advances in the community Earth system model that allows us to explore some of these dynamics in more details. The first is the CSM large ensemble. This is a community experiment where the Earth system model is initialized with small perturbations for a range of different ensemble members, and then we take the large ensemble mean to isolate the effect of external forcing from internally generated variability. That's because as you run the ensemble members for a few years with small initial perturbations, you end up randomizing the modes of internal variability so that the ensemble mean isolate the external forcing effect. We can see that in the large ensemble in black here that shows the long-term warming, so global warming as an external forcing driver. We could also see that in the volcanic eruptions, substantial cooling, global mean surface temperature, and also with aerosols, if we emit the effects of aerosols versus if we emit the effects of greenhouse gas. So first vignette on the volcanic effects. I'm not going to go into details about how volcanoes impact atmospheric chemistry and climate. This really nice review by Laura Marshall describes both what we know and what we still don't know, but essentially aerosols from explosive volcanic eruptions essentially put sulfates into the stratosphere, which reacts and creates sulfate aerosols, which then change the radiative budget of the stratosphere and the troposphere by scattering incoming shortwave radiance back, which leads to surface cooling in the troposphere and on land, which then leads to SST cooling and changes in the ocean heat content, but also there's absorption of infrared from these aerosols that drive stratospheric heating, which can change atmospheric dynamics and also ocean dynamics. And there's quite a lot of open questions still on how these mechanisms are operating. So how does oxygen and carbon respond to volcanic eruptions in the model? We know that the SSTs cool and that the ocean loses a substantial amount of heat. What we find is that there is a large uptake of oxygen and carbon following each of the eruptions of Agung, El Chichon, and Pinatubo. And that the responses of the oxygen and carbon flux are actually not happening in the same area. Carbon is mostly taken up anomalously in the low latitudes, mostly the equatorial Pacific cold tongue, whereas oxygen is primarily taken up in higher latitude, North Atlantic and North Pacific. So going back to Jorge's article, which posed another really important question, what mechanisms could cause Pinatubo effects on carbon and oxygen anomalies? Surprisingly, what we found is that the carbon response is not necessarily driven by the temperature effects on surface PCO2, but actually changes in the transport of the IC to the surface. That's tied to the El Nino-like response in the climate system following the eruption, whereby cooling over land much faster than the ocean, and it drives a thermal gradient in surface air temperature, which drives westerly winds and wind anomalies that initiate El Nino-like conditions a year after, and a substantial change in the thermocline of the equatorial Pacific. So essentially less DIC going up to the surface, driving an anomalous uptake of carbon. So a dynamical response. This is also important for oxygen. The dynamical response is important for oxygen, but in a different region. When we decompose the air sea flux of oxygen into a thermal component driven mainly by solubility versus a non-thermal component associated with changes in ventilation intensity, we see that the solubility effect contributes at most half of the air sea flux. So there's a change in the ventilation dynamics of the high latitudes as a response to these tropical eruptions. We see that here in some new simulations that we've done where we isolate the effects of the Pinatubo eruptions more clearly in the Earth system model, where there's substantial widespread oxygen anomalies being diffused into the ocean following these eruptions. So this is really neat because it tells us that the dynamical response of the Earth system to these radiative perturbations can actually induce most of the anomalies in ocean biogeochemistry. So it suggests that the climate response is actually pretty important. And just to sort of bring the point home, if we look at the signature of these anomalies in the ocean's interior, whereas temperature anomalies sort of only survive for a few years after the Pinatubo eruption, oxygen, when it's taken up, essentially the anomaly survives for several years, almost to a decade following the eruption. So these have substantial impacts on the interannual to decadal timescale variability of oxygen. Whereas for DIC or carbon, we see that the anomaly is short-lived, and that's because it's associated with that El Nino-like response. So switching gears here from the interannual timescales to multi-decadal timescales, and from natural sources to anthropogenic sources. Here, a new single forcing large ensemble experiment has allowed us to actually decompose the effects of industrial aerosols from greenhouse gases. This has been generally, the two forcings have been generally included in most model simulations. Shown here in black, this is the CSM large ensemble anomaly in the global oxygen inventory, and in dashed is the oxygen anomaly from observations. We see that we generally reproduce a long-term decrease of oxygen in the climate system. This has been mostly associated with greenhouse gas warming, but when you actually isolate the effects of greenhouse gases from aerosols, so when you do a run without greenhouse gases and when you do a run without aerosols, what we find is that aerosols drive a substantial slowdown of ocean deoxygenation. So without greenhouse gases, the ocean deoxygenation rate is almost double. So that means that aerosols have led to an increase in the oxygen content. So this is really, really critical for attribution. Not only that, we also found that the aerosol effect is highly spatial, so it's not global. The largest anomalies are found in the North Pacific and North Atlantic, very similar to volcanic eruptions. So that suggests that there is some mechanistic resemblance between these two forcings. And I suspect and hypothesize that it has to do with the spatial heterogeneity in aerosol distributions, whereby most of the aerosols are being emitted from Asia and North America, some from biomass burning in the South American and African continents, that imprint on the oxygen content because of the short residence time scale of aerosols in the troposphere. So this was really surprising to me, that aerosols can have such a big impact on the long-term oxygen content, because when we look at the aerosol effects on pretty much all other tracers, they're fairly small or modest. For global mean surface temperature, without aerosols, don't get that much more warming, whereas without aerosols, we get almost a doubling of ocean deoxygenation. So this suggests that oxygen is really sensitive to these radiative perturbations, and part of that is the dynamical response, not just the solubility effect. So with that, I want to turn to open questions that I think are really important for us to think about, but also that are directly tied to these natural and anthropogenic sources of aerosols. The first one is there a role for external forcing modulation of internal variability? So that volcanic impact on carbon fluxes has been discussed in the context of decadal variability and the ocean carbon sink. There's this open question of what's causing the weaker sink during the 1990s and the acceleration of the carbon sink after 2000. Paper by Gale and McKinley shows, using a box model, that if you take changes in the atmospheric carbon content and the volcanic SST cooling effect, you can essentially reproduce this decadal variability. 2 years later, there's a really nice rebuttal by Tim de Vries that uses a different model and shows that if you add these two effects, you actually don't really get that much of a variability on these timescales. So I think this question is still open. And one hypothesis is neither of these models include the aerosol effect on climate dynamics, El Nino southern oscillation changes or decadal variability. So can we account, or how does that external modulation of climate modes influence the ocean biogeochemistry? Is that important in this context? Another important question for those of us who are involved in the decadal surveys, like GoShip, the largest number of cruise observations were made almost immediately after the eruption of Pinatubo. This shows in color the shading, the anomaly associated with the Pinatubo, and then the number of observations in the decade after. You'll know that if you take measurements a decade after Pinatubo, chances are your observations are going to be highly biased or aliased. This paper by Holly Olivares shows their impact on anthropogenic carbon and natural carbon budgets, or anomalies from the P16 and the P16, A16 cruises and the Southern Ocean cruises, that if you were to look at the impact of Pinatubo, you see very little influence on the anthropogenic carbon content, very little signal. But if you look at the natural dissolved inorganic carbon, pre-industrial carbon content change, most of the anomalies are associated with Pinatubo. So that's really important. And then from the industrial sources, there's some open questions that I think are really relevant for this long-term oxygen decline. The aerosol effects of the climate effects of aerosols are, as I've shown, are really important based on the model. But they also induce geochemical impacts on aerosols via the atmospheric deposition of iron and phosphorus and nitrate. A paper by Taka Ito shows that the atmospheric deposition effects tend to reduce oxygen in the tropical and northeast Pacific. So climate and biogeochemical effect of aerosols tend to counteract each other. So what is the net impact of aerosols on oxygen? And then how do all of these sources come into influencing the long-term change in oxygen and its variability beyond just the PDO explanation of Curtis Deutsch and others? And then I want to end on a happy note, nuclear war, which so I've mentioned just two potential sources of aerosol impacts on climate. There were some really interesting studies on how nuclear war might impact ocean ecosystems using the same model, but inducing much larger amounts of sulfates into the atmosphere with different scenarios. If there was a war between the US and Russia, India and Pakistan, different sulfate emissions. Surprisingly, that El Nino response still persists even on these magnitudes, which induces large anomalies in vertical velocity along the equatorial Pacific, so really slow down of the upwelling regime that leads to substantial changes in NPP anomaly or primary production in really key regions. So 60% is quite large in the Peruvian EEZ. So another bummer about nuclear war is the lack of seafood, and maybe we should keep that in mind. So with that, I'll open it up for questions, and I'll be happy to discuss many of these throughout the week.
Okay, thank you, Yassir. Really interesting talk and a lot of food for thought there. So we have time for a couple questions.
Thanks, Scott. I have a sort of clarification question on when you do the oxygen anomaly budget, you say you switch off the aerosols. Which one, you're removing all aerosols, or which aerosols are you removing when you do that?
Yeah, good question. So when we remove the aerosol effects in the CSM model, you can remove fossil fuel emissions. You can also remove biomass burning emissions. Those are considered differently. The biomass burning emissions actually induce a decrease in oxygen because of the absorption of infrared radiation by black carbon and soot, whereas the sulfate aerosol emissions from fossil fuel burning acts mostly to reflect sunlight back. So that's another really nice thing about this single forcing large ensemble is you can decompose different kinds of aerosols. We did not take out the volcanic, we did not do a single forcing large ensemble with eruptions on those long time scales, but we did so with the Pinatubo eruption, just to use that as an example. So even between the different sources of aerosol, there's quite a lot of differences in response.
Yeah, hi, Yasser, thank you. Did you look at Cerro Hudson, which was mostly a tropospheric volcanic event, which was about the same time as Pinatubo, and see if there was any differences in effect in your models?
I'm not familiar with that eruption. Yeah, so I am not familiar with that eruption. However, there's been quite a few smaller volcanic eruptions around the 2000s that don't necessarily puncture through into the stratosphere that have been actually folks have related them to the hiatus in global warming during the 2000s as essentially a source of negative shortwave anomalies. So it's a bunch of small eruptions that only operates in the troposphere might induce changes in climate, but those are less clearly understood as the more volcanic explosive eruptions that puncture the stratosphere. However, I think with the observing system that we have, we could probably do better with these smaller eruptions as well as the next eruptions whenever it happens.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, so next up we have Steve Beaupre from Stony Brook University, formerly from UC Irvine. Go Anteaters. Steve is going to talk about some observations through a plastic lens. Sounds intriguing. We'll see what that's all about.
Okay, so first, thank you for letting me be here. It's really great to see so many old friends and to make some new ones as well. I'm going to talk to you today about some observations I've had on observations of plastic in the ocean through collaboration with Gordon Taylor and his former student Luis Medina and his tech Tatiana. Pictures up there because they really are the brains behind all of this using that instrument. They're a wonderful system that knows how to use it and just eke out every bit of precision and accuracy from it. And so the first disclosure I'll make is that I am not a polymer chemist. I do not deliberately study plastics in the ocean, but serving on Luis's committee, I've come to realize that I can no longer ignore it in my own work, and that's why I wanted to share this with you, and I was asked to share this with you. So Luis was interested in looking at a variety of things in water, and using this instrument, no matter where he looked, he always found plastic. And it sort of dominated his observations until that sort of became the main story that he was interested in. He's already published several papers on this, and there's maybe 2 or 3 more probably coming out in a few months, we hope. And so for me, what came out of this is that when I'm trying to study air-sea exchange, I'm thinking about the provenance of the carbon atoms under the framework that they only do 3 things. They move from place to place, they can transform into different substances by physical, chemical, or nuclear processes, and they interact with the energy in the environment. And so when I'm thinking about this in terms of natural carbon, plastics do pretty much the same thing, and many of our observations, our methods are blind. So as you can imagine here, in this nice review by Aaron Stubbins, if you're new to plastics, this is a really accessible review, a great place to start. And basically what it was showing is that since the 1950s, the amount of plastic in the environment has been accumulating. So if you take the amount that's produced and subtract the amount that's been incinerated, that's what we're left with. And it's increasing at a rate that can be modeled as a cubic function of time. And so this is already in the environment, and it's projected to keep increasing. So this isn't a new problem or one for the future. It's already here and maybe affecting our observations now. Here's another figure that thankfully showed up from Aaron's his nice review. And it's just showing where you can find plastics. So you might think that it's only in the coast. It's not. You might think it's only at the sea surface because most of it is less dense than seawater, so it'll be concentrated there. It's not. It's also in the ocean interior and the subsurface down to the sea floor and sediments. And it's also in air where some particles are small enough to be transported for large distances. So for air-sea exchange, this tells us, at least if you're looking for plastics and seeing what they're doing, number one, they can get from land to the ocean, to the Arctic and everywhere else through atmospheric transport. So they might affect our observations there. And since it's already in the ocean, it could come back out. And so there are people who are looking at these things deliberately trying to understand what plastics are doing. So, so the question I'm looking at is, how do we observe the plastics to begin with? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that instrument I showed you a picture of in the beginning. And this is a Raman spectrometer. So basically what it is, it's an optical technique. It looks at the inelastic scattering of photons of certain wavelengths. And so if you look at the spectra on the left, the wave numbers run from about 500 to 1800. So it's like infrared, but it's not looking at absorption. It's looking at inelastic scattering. And with this instrument, Gordon and his tech, Tatiana, are able to eliminate a lot of interferences and backgrounds to boost these signals and use this instrument, which is coupled with other microscopy techniques,
to scan through a sample, locate particles, interrogate them with lasers, and find the chemical composition. So this is a reflected light microscopy image of a sample that's in the instrument, and rastering across, it located a spot that has the Raman signature of polystyrene. And so it can keep doing this back and forth and identify and allow us to count how many particles are in the sample. And another interesting feature that it can do is this instrument is capable of changing the depth at which it's focusing on a particle. So it can raster through a particle to find its chemical composition and then look deeper and deeper to give 3D images of the chemical composition and the size of the particle. So not only can you get, let's say, particle number distribution, but you can get a particle mass distribution if you have estimates of the density of the particle itself. So what Luis did is he looked at several places, getting near surface samples, about a ½ liter of seawater from the Chukchi and Bering shelves from along the coast of the United States, just shoreward of the Gulf Stream, and 10 sites around Venezuela, following a salinity transect from about 5 PSU to about 30, so near river plume. And they'd take about a ½ liter of seawater, they'd sieve it for larger particles, and then filter it onto alumina filter that has about 0.2 micron diameter pores, and then see what they find. And basically, this is what they find. So here's a number distribution where they take this particle and basically take the volume and convert it into what you would expect if it was a sphere and report it as the effective equivalent spherical diameter. And it follows a power law distribution. So the interesting thing is that most of the particles are very small, so less than 5 micrometer in diameter, and getting into the range where they might be important for air-sea exchange for the purpose of this talk. But the other thing that's really important is that if you're trying to observe these particles in the ocean by a net tow, the typical pore size in the net is closer to 300 microns. So if you wanted to observe the smallest particles observed by that method, you would have to extrapolate this scale about 6 times and maybe get a coffee at Pie in the Sky, and then walk on the other side of it toward the ferry, and you might see that size distribution. So it's telling us the first concern is that the most abundant plastic particles in the ocean probably are escaping detection while we're searching for them. But with the right method, we can see that this is a much more pervasive problem than we might have otherwise believed. My second concern is that the particles often escape detection while we're not looking for them, which kind of sounds silly, but it makes sense. So when I look at the literature or talk to some friends, and they're making their measurements like I do for radiocarbon or C13 or other things, there's often the implicit assumption that maybe the method is selective, and we don't have to worry about it, or that the particles are negligible contribution, but that's not necessarily the case. And so we devised a little experiment to use a common technique to analyze organic matter samples from the ocean, elemental analysis, whereby you basically take a sample, some solid form, and combust it in this instrument, and it will produce CO2 and many other byproducts, and you can quantify them. If you know the mass of the sample, you can get the percent carbon, percent nitrogen, the stoichiometric abundance. You can harvest the CO2 that comes out and get the C13 signature, and maybe also the radiocarbon age, depending upon how big your sample is. And so some things we've heard are that, for example, this is sort of maybe a silly test. Reason being that this instrument combusts organic matter at a very high temperature, so of course it's going to combust the plastics. But these things also have nonlinearities. They're calibrated for natural samples, and they have limits. And a small amount of plastic could make your sample go beyond the calibration curve, if you're lucky. And then you would identify there being a problem, maybe throw it out using Chauvenet's criterion from Bill's book. But if it's not that big, it may be close to the error of your measurements and insidiously induce a bias. So the idea then is that we have organic carbon. We're going to add oxygen and assume there's plastic in there and look at the amount of CO2 that comes out. So you can take a pure sediment sample, throw it in the instrument, uncontaminated, and get the CO2 and know the percent carbon that's there. So therefore, when I take another sample, I know how much carbon to expect. I can predict the yield on the pure sediment. I can do the same thing separately with plastic, get the percent carbon. So now when I make admixtures, I can calculate the yield I would expect if both of these materials, the natural sample and the plastic, are co-oxidized independently in the instrument. We're trying to look at the efficiency of this process when these two substances are mixed. So the simple experiment that Luis performed is he took sediment from Long Island Sound that had been decarbonated and polystyrene particles, and those are about 92% carbon by mass, and mixed them in various proportions, put them in the EA to see how efficient this process was. And so I'm just going to walk you through a few of the results here. So the first thing is, do the predictions and the observations match? Which is sort of how I do science. I like to try to calculate or predict a number that will be observed or vice versa. And so on the left, we're looking at the yield of carbon from these mixtures of plastic and sediment, and the actual yield that's measured in the dots with the error bars. And the dashed line is not a regression line, that's what we would predict. So it seems that at least within uncertainty of the measurement, this instrument does co-oxidize these two materials independently and quantitatively. And then we start to look at all the other information we would get from this method. So one would be percent carbon, that's what you get from NEA. So over here, I'm showing the mole fraction of carbon atoms from polystyrene. So in other words, how many carbon atoms came from polystyrene out of all the carbon atoms in the mixture? And so it goes from 0 to 1, 0.5 would be 50% of the carbon atoms, 1 out of 2. And the black line represents what we would predict from theory, just basic conservation of mass. And the data points are what we observed. And again, they're right on there showing that this method is also sensitive to plastic contamination and consistent with 100% oxidation efficiency. The next one we could logically look at is elemental ratios. So these are used for all kinds of studies. And again, we're looking at C to N ratios that are measured versus the mole fraction of polystyrene in these mixtures, going from 0 to 100%, which is not shown there because it's so far off the chart. The black line represents what we would predict if the polystyrene was completely devoid of nitrogen. And the data points mostly fall through it except for the one to the right. But it turns out that plastics are not always pure. They can have additives that give them other properties they want, including color that might contain nitrogen. So the gray line is a least squares regression that tries to predict the optimal value of carbon to nitrogen ratios in the polystyrene that would explain all the data, and it comes out to be 152. So what this says to me is that, again, it's following conservation of mass, it's doing what we would expect, it's perturbing the measurements, and depending upon the kind and degradation state of the polymer, it could induce variability in what you would expect from your results. And just to go back here for a moment, if you look at what we have here, these are the mole fractions of carbon atoms from polystyrene, and they're going from 0 to 1. And you might say, how realistic would it be to have a sample of sediment or sample on a filter that would have 75% of the carbon atoms from poly? You would see that particle, right? Or 50% of the carbon atoms come from polystyrene. You would probably see it. Well, so we tried to look at that a little more closely too, just doing a simple analysis. So we can convert mole fraction to mass fraction and look at the relationship. So in other words, on the x-axis here, this would be the total mass of plastic per total mass of your mixture. So for example, if you had a 100 microgram sample of some natural material that was contaminated, and only 1 microgram of that sample was polystyrene, then it would be all the points that align on the red line to the left, 1% by mass, polystyrene. And each of these curves is sort of different hypothetical sediments. So the top one is saying that the uncontaminated sample of sediment comprises only 1% carbon. And a few other cases from 1 to 2.5 to 5 to 10. And so what you can see, I think, is that it's extraordinarily sensitive to plastic contamination because it's so enriched in carbon. So along the range that we're seeing there, which is typical of sediments you might find in the ocean, if your sediment sample is naturally 1% carbon and it's contaminated with just 1% by mass polystyrene, about 50% of the carbon atoms could be coming from the polystyrene. So those graphs I showed you before that seem outrageous, they're not that outrageous. This is what scared me, right? Because the plastic's already in the ocean, we've made a lot of observations, and this is just a model for the kind of observations that we do that are often blind to other forms of carbon. Okay. So then you might ask, okay, what does this mean for other observations? And just as a note, I don't think the timer is moving. Yeah, that seems about right. Thank you, Rachel. Okay. So what I've shown here is the error we would expect from conservation of mass in the delta 13C, the stable isotopic signature of the samples I showed you before over the range that you would expect with just 1% polystyrene by mass. And you can see that with 1% polystyrene by mass, the mole fraction can range from close to 10 to close to 50% of the carbon atoms, and it can decrease the delta 13C by anywhere from 1 to 6 per mil, which is pretty dramatic and might make you think that the carbon you're looking at didn't come from the place you thought it was coming from. You can do the same calculation for the error you would expect in the radiocarbon age. So in those same confines for that hypothetical sample with polystyrene, assuming that it was manufactured from fossil materials and is C14 free, the radiocarbon age could be off by hundreds to thousands of years. Yeah. As someone who obsesses over like blanks and standards and uncertainty and radiocarbon, this was kind of shocking to me. Okay, so if anyone's unfamiliar with some of these terms, there's this nice review paper in Earth Science Reviews that sort of shows you how you can look at some of these various common measurements and interpret them. So in this space, looking at the variation that you might find in nature for C13 and correlating it with the variation you might find in the stoichiometric ratio of carbon to nitrogen, these different pools fall out in these different regions. And that white circle over there is, again, our original hypothetical marine sediment from Long Island Sound. And if you start to contaminate with 1% polystyrene by mass within the range that I showed you, it might go from looking like something like marine POC or sediment to something that's looking like freshwater DOC or a terrestrial sample. So with this small amount of polystyrene in there, if you're not observing it or quantifying it in some way, we may be doing source apportionments erroneously. We may be measuring the persistence and lability of carbon erroneously. And so I'm not sure what to do with this information other than to share it with you because it was surprising to me and because Luis Medina is an outstanding scientist and he's been working with Gordon, who's an outstanding scientist, and has this wonderful instrument that's making my work, I hope, better. So this is what I'm left with. Number one, these plastics are ubiquitous. And they're predominantly much smaller than we formerly realized, and therefore may be more impactful, not just on, for example, air-sea exchange, but on every observation on which every model and every other interpretation is based. And so there's two parts to this. The contamination may be small, and therefore the errors could be kind of insidious. Again, not necessarily easily observed as an outlier. And then the second part is that if the contamination is not consistent, there's many different types of polymers with different percent carbon and nitrogen, it can lead to additional variability in our observations that increases our measurement uncertainty, right? And that's the fundamental limit to answering and finding new scientific questions. So the variability is real. You're observing carbon that's moving or reacting, but we may not be attributing it to the sources we think we are. So my conclusion was that we probably just can't implicitly ignore this anymore, and I certainly can't. So I guess what I'm left with is that it really will come down to moving forward for me and getting the most precise and accurate and properly interpreted results, but paying very close attention to blanks and standards and getting additional information to, in the words of Richard Feynman, I guess, using numerical tweezers to constrain our uncertainty properly so we can really talk about what we know and what we don't. And again, I was just a mentor, so my second disclaimer is that if you have any questions about polymers or about the technical aspects of this Raman, there are other experts like Gordon, who's here in the room. And so I don't have much else to share with you other than to say this was eye-opening for me, and I hope that all of you consider this in your own observations. So with that, I'd like to thank all these wonderful people and funding sources and all of you for being here. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. A very interesting talk. So now that everyone's worried about plastic contamination in their measurements, do you have any questions for Steve?
Hi, great talk. I'm Charlie Coleman, Skidaway Institute of Oceanography. I am reminded really of trace metal chemistry and sort of the plight of trace metal chemists. In terms of contamination, you're talking about how easy it is to contaminate. So given that this is sort of like a newer type of field of study, what sort of controls are you taking for potential aerosol contamination when you're sampling, like during the collection processing? Like, do you imagine this is going to be a clean bubble type situation going forward, or?
Well, it's hard to answer that, and I guess I would say that every observation we make, it doesn't matter what it is implicitly observational. So you saw this morning, Kim Prather has this wonderful technique to look at things in the ocean that's different from other techniques that are used. And so I think it has to be kind of case by case and looking at uncertainties, you know, thinking about everything I do starts with error propagation. If I'm designing an experiment, it starts with, can this even be observed? Right? So yeah, I think it's case by case. I really don't know. What I can say is for Luis's work, he did do some control shipboard that I don't think anybody else really does. So he did put millicue water into the Niskin bottles, flush them out to take sort of a field sampling blank and see what he found, and he didn't find anything there. And so, you know, it might mean extra work, but if it means decreasing our uncertainties and advancing science, we have to find a way to do that as efficiently as possible. A great question. Wish I had a better answer.
Masha Prokopenko, Pomona College. So do you have, from your own data, do you have like an example where you suspect this insidious bias, where you looked and it's like, is it terrestrial carbon or is it plastic? Do you have some examples like that? Have you seen it? Rather, have you seen it?
I haven't gone back and looked at my data. This is all fairly recent, but it's on my mind. And I can give you one example. Before moving to Stony Brook, I was at Harvard and helped build this continuous flow bioreactor. We monitor the evolution of CO2 over like the course of 10 days. And I'm watching the radiocarbon come out and it's looking beautiful. It's getting younger and younger over the course of 10 days. It indicates that the organisms are consuming material that's getting older and older post-bomb. And there's one point that was so far off. It was old. And I said, what is that? But we repeated the experiment, and it came out identical. Another 10-day incubation with the same microbes, same sediment, came out like clockwork. And so it seemed to be unlikely that this one point was a plastic contamination based on probability. But it's the kind of thing that makes my left eye twitch at night and lose sleep, and so I might want to revisit all of my data. Yeah, it's scary, but it's important. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks. Thank you.
All right, and to wrap up the pre-lunch part of our session, we have 4 great lightning talks lined up. So if all the speakers could be kind of somewhere near the front on standby, and we'll just roll through with the 5 minutes each and pass it on. I'll let each speaker introduce themselves.
Okay, I am Suzanne Craig from NASA Goddard and UMBC, guest star 2. I want to acknowledge, first of all, that a lot of this work was from a co-advised master's student, Yun Chen Lee, along with my other co-I there, Mark Gibson. Okay, so as we heard this morning in Kim's wonderful talk
phytoplankton and their associated microbial communities, the bacteria, emit a complex suite of volatile organic compounds, not just DMS, a complex suite of lots of different things. However, the fluxes and the chemical speciation of these VOCs are fairly poorly characterized. We know they're there, we know there's a lot of them, but we're not quite sure what they are all comprised of. These VOCs, as we've heard, under certain conditions can form secondary organic aerosols and or cloud condensation nuclei. They are small in size, meaning that they're relatively freshly formed and have undergone limited particle accretion or particle growth. Why are we interested? Well, clouds and aerosols still remain the largest source of uncertainty in global climate models. What I'm going to show you here briefly are some highlights of results that we carried out as part of the NASA NAMES study. We had an atmospheric chemistry supersite situated on Sable Island, which is a tiny little sandbar spit of land off of the coast of Nova Scotia in Canada. We measured all manner of atmospheric chemistry metrics, which included ultrafine particle counts and several size bins, along with simultaneous measurements of VOC. If you Google Sable Island, the first thing that you're going to see are beautiful pictures of the wild herd of horses that lived there. They were shipwrecked hundreds of years ago, and now they just live there endemically. You also will see that there are up to 10,000 seals that haul out there every year and pup, which makes getting to your sampling shed a bit of a challenge in the morning. What I'm showing here is a time series from part of our study for the very small size bins of those small particles, the two smallest. There are elevated regions in those concentrations, and I want to focus in on the spring bloom, which is that box 2. What I'm showing here on the left is an air mass back trajectory, which essentially tells us where the air originated from, where each of the little symbols on the lines indicate a 6-hour time step. To the right-hand panel, this is a satellite chlorophyll image with Sable Island sampling site in the black star. And what you see is that the air mass originated in the relatively clean part of the North American continent up in the Hudson Bay area, moved down sparsely populated areas, and in this last few hours before it reached Sable Island, it did indeed pass over a region of enhanced primary productivity. So I'm telling you a bit of a smoking gun story here. I now want to focus on the correlation between chlorophyll and these very small particles. If we look at the red outline boxes, I'm showing chlorophyll and particle number concentration plotted together, and you see that for those two small size bins, they're really quite tightly correlated. As you move down up in size, particle size, that correlation begins to degrade and almost disappear, essentially because larger particles are associated with long-range transport from the continent prior to reaching us at Sable Island. What I'm showing here is another little snippet of our time series. Focus first of all to the left of that red dotted line, and that blue line there, oh, we're nearly finished, is large particles, showing that the air mass actually originated in the North American continent and went over a ton of industrial sites. So that makes a lot of sense for large particles. Contrast that with the small particles and the second half of the time series, where the air mass actually came from really quite a clean part of the North American continent. And indeed, when you see the satellite chlorophyll with the little Sable Island and the white star, that air mass did indeed pass over enhanced chlorophyll production, corresponding to the autumnal bloom, the fall bloom. Take-home message is that we saw a very strong correlation between phytoplankton and those associated microbial communities and small particles, likely secondary organic aerosols, in the Northwest Atlantic. Thank you.
Hello. So I'll jump straight into it because I have a stutter and there's a time limit, and those two things don't famously work well together. So when we are looking at the impact of DMS on climate, we are typically interested in how much is in the seawater, how much is emitted into the atmosphere, and then how much sulfate is produced. We use seawater DMS observations, seen here in the map, to produce large-scale estimates. However, there are multiple estimates available, and they all have up to 100% regional and monthly differences by using different amounts of similar input data. Then there are uncertainties associated with the transfer velocity. For example, the Godwin-Murphy, which is a linear one, or the Nightingale, which is a quadratic one, and then a few options in between. There are also uncertainties based on the choice of oxidation that you use, which can impact the lifetime of DMS from less than a day to multiple days. In order to constrain some of these uncertainties, we have compiled an atmospheric DMS observation data set, which has about 600,000 measurements, which is approximately 2/3 the size of the seawater DMS data set. And we're using this along with the GSDL AM3 atmospheric model in order to investigate the links between observed atmospheric DMS and the key uncertainties that precede it. So I'm just going to drop on here what looks like a load of figures, but I'll do my best to explain them as fast as I can. What you're looking at are vertical profiles of atmospheric DMS measured by aircraft, and then box and whiskers of DMS in the atmosphere measured by ships. The observations are in red, and then on the top row, we fixed the transfer velocity and the oxidants as the linear K and the AM3 oxidants from the GSDL model, and then we alter the seawater DMS. And on the bottom row, we fix the DMS using the Holswar, and then we alter the transfer velocity using the Nightingale or the GeoChem oxidants. And basically what you can see is that there is a disconnect in observed DMS between the surface and the altitude, especially at higher latitudes, not captured by the model. The Galley and or the Wang perform similarly to or better than the Holswar, especially at high latitudes where the observations are most sparse. The faster oxidants and the linear K are nearest the observations, whereas the GeoChem oxidants get you furthest from the observations, except for the southern hemisphere summer, where strong high latitude winds mean that using the quadratic transfer velocity leads to higher emissions. You can essentially see by looking at all the figures that you can essentially scale the DMS higher using slower oxidants or a quadratic transfer velocity, or lower using more conservative DMS estimates in seawater. However, we find that all model configurations are biased high relative to the low DMS observed by aircraft, and that's regardless of the choices that you make on the seawater DMS, the transfer velocity, or the oxidants. And this is just the local summer months, but this is the case in all seasons and in all regions. I will just say that we have a poster, and I would welcome anybody that wants to speak about this stuff there, and anybody who wants to add some data into this data set would also welcome that as well.
Hi, Dave Keever, SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. I'm going to talk about some work, 2 points I want to make, and this is with colleagues from many institutions, Steve being one of them, Stony Brook, and work we've been doing over 15 years trying to characterize the organic matter that's produced by primary marine aerosols, primarily in blue water, so getting away from the coast, the Sargasso Sea. And one of the things we looked at is what's called refractory dissolved organic carbon, thought to be about 95% of the total carbon pool in the oceans. And it has a long radiocarbon lifetime age, over 6,000 years. And the question is, how does this stuff removed and where does it come from? We're suggesting that one of the sources is getting up into the atmosphere as part of primary marine aerosols, PMA, and therein getting oxidized. Much more highly oxidized environment than the surface ocean. When 2 points I want to make. The first one is, as you probably surmised through the literature and some of today's talks, is that we think of surfactants and material getting into aerosols in the atmosphere as mostly recently biologically produced in the photic zone. What I want to say today is that, in fact, this RDOC is part of that pool. And the first experiment we did to show this was we took North Atlantic deep water for 2,500 meters, and we produced aerosols, and we looked at the production of organic carbon enrichments in the aerosol that we produced. And what you can see is in the near surface seawater, over all aerosol size ranges, that the enrichment factors of the deep water when we produced the aerosols was the same order of magnitude, factor of 100 or so. So this says that the oceans have surfactants throughout them. It's not just something that's produced near the surface. The second thing is that the primary marine aerosols contain RDOC and not just organic carbon from recent biological activity. Using natural abundance C14 measurements, we calculated that from anywhere from 20 to 40% of that organic carbon in the aerosols was this RDOC. And that was during the summertime. We're doing a wintertime cruise data that we're analyzing to see if there's a seasonal pattern of this at BATS. So to summarize, you got this plume of bubbles. It's mostly about the bubbles. The bubbles are what generate the microlayer and what destroy the microlayer, the breaking waves. It's not about the microlayer itself. In fact, when these bubble plumes, these rafts come up, they push that microlayer away. It's all about the bubbles and absorption and desorption of organic matter on the bubbles. This stuff gets up in the atmosphere, again, much more oxidizing environment, low pH, this stuff evolves. The ones we're most interested in, where mostly organic matter, is the submicron particles, which are much more highly enriched than the supermicron particles. Low pH, you get oxidants, you form low labile organic carbon, things like acetic acid, formic acid, carbonyl compounds. Some of these things are still in particles, wet, dry deposition, get into the ocean, you basically complete the cycle. You can also form inorganic carbon, carbon monoxide. Thank you. Summarize these two papers.
Hi, I'm going to jump right into it. So usually when we're thinking about greenhouse gases, we usually think about carbon dioxide, which makes sense. It's the big one. It has the greatest overall radiative forcing on Earth's climate. But of course, there are other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide. And in particular, each molecule of nitrous oxide has the global warming potential of 273 molecules of carbon dioxide. So you may have heard me say before, if carbon dioxide is the currency of climate change, then nitrous oxide is the $300 bill. Biogeochemical Argo float data can provide a more comprehensive picture of air-sea greenhouse gas fluxes. This is a great paper from Allison Gray, just looking at carbon dioxide fluxes from the Southern Ocean. And without going into too much detail, essentially, the biogeochemical Argo floats allow us to resolve scales of variability that shipboard measurements cannot. So we went about trying to assess nitrous oxide emissions from the Southern Ocean, and we hypothesized that atmospheric pressure was going to play a pretty big role. And the way we went about this is we trained machine learning models on a global GoShip nitrous oxide data set, much of which was generated by Bonnie Chang, who's here today, and then apply those machine learning models to biogeochemical Argo float data. So this is what our model predicted nitrous oxide pressure disequilibrium looks like in the Southern Ocean. I'll just point out that we have 20,000 profiles in this data set, so we're able to capture these very small
but intense blips of nitrous oxide disequilibrium. This is what the air sea flux looks like. And again, we're able to capture these brief but intense emission events. And it turns out that most of these emission events are happening in the center of low pressure storms. So this is the profile where we saw the highest nitrous oxide flux, and you can see it's just sitting right in the center of where this massively low pressure storm passes through. And this is the kind of measurement that, of course, we would never be able to make with a ship, right? To go to the middle of a storm like this in a ship would be crazy. So it just shows kind of the advantage of using autonomous float data. If you take all of our fluxes and you sum them up, and you calculate the flux with the real sea level pressure, and then assuming the sea level pressure is 1 atmosphere, the pressure effect accounts for about 68% of the cumulative flux. Another way of looking at this is looking at what proportion of the cumulative flux occurs below the median sea level pressure. And in this case, 85% of the cumulative flux is occurring at pressures below the median sea level pressure. So there are two kind of key takeaways here. The first of which is that the float data allows us to capture these brief, intense nitrous oxide emission events in the center of these low pressure storms. And the second takeaway is more broadly, atmospheric pressure is an important driver of Southern Ocean nitrous oxide emissions. So going forward, we're looking at this flux distribution story in a more quantitative sense. What proportion of Southern Ocean nitrous oxide emissions are happening in the middle of these low pressure storms? And I'll just thank our many, many sources of funding for this project.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back after the lunch to a continuation of the air-sea interaction session. We're going to start with 2 more plenary talks, then another series of lightning talks, and then we're going to have our discussion. So now let me introduce Kara Manning from the University of Connecticut.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here and great to be back at OCB in person. So I'm going to be talking about methane fluxes in the Arctic Ocean. Is there a carbon bomb or not? And if you want any of the references I talk about, they're all on my website. So you can check that out later. If there's a paper that you want to read, I have a link to it online. And so when I teach undergraduates, I like to start my classes with a song that is thematically related to the lecture in some way. And so because I like you all, I'm going to do the same thing for you too. The song that I've chosen for today is Houdini by Dua Lipa. So just wanted to boost your serotonin levels a little bit to help you get through the afternoon. And I'll explain why I chose that song as we go along in the lecture. So why would we want to measure methane? So methane is a potent greenhouse gas, and its atmospheric concentration is increasing. So the schematic on the left here shows the concentration of methane in parts per million from the year 1500 to present day. And you can see before the Industrial Revolution, it was below about 0.8 parts per million, and now it is close to 2 parts per million. And just like nitrous oxide, methane is a really efficient heat trapper. So over a 20-year time scale, it's 84 times more efficient at trapping heat than CO2. Over 100 years, that decreases to 34 times because the atmospheric lifetime of methane is lower. And so there's concern that as we start to warm the climate, this could potentially mobilize large stores of carbon that are currently stored in solid substrates, and that these substrates could be turned to liquid or fluid and allow the carbon to escape. So these are things like permafrost and methane hydrates, and you can see that the inventory of both of these is much larger than the current inventory of carbon in the atmosphere. And so when I talk about the carbon bomb, what I'm defining that is a sudden and massive release of methane that would occur over several years, leading to rapid and catastrophic warming. So, if all the methane hydrates were to, right now, they're solid ice with methane in them. If they were to melt and thaw, and that methane is released to the atmosphere, it could cause catastrophic climate change. And these are just a few of the headlines that have been, appearing in the popular press talking about the concept of this carbon bomb. So now let's actually look at some data to see whether this is actually happening. And so there has been some studies that have actually concluded that methane emissions from the East Siberian Arctic shelf, which is the Russian side of the Arctic, are on par with previous estimates of methane emissions from the global ocean. So this is a paper by Shakova et al. This is all surface concentrations of methane. And you can see that the scale bar here goes up to 400 nanomoles per kilogram. Equilibrium here is about 4, so up to 100 times equilibrium, very high concentrations. Typically, you would not expect to see in the surface of the open ocean. And so based on these data, they upscaled to the full East Siberian Arctic shelf, and they quantified a flux of methane of 17 teragrams of methane per year. And around the same time, there was an estimate of the global methane budget that estimated total methane fluxes from the global ocean were around 14 teragrams of methane. So it seems like, is the carbon bomb already happening if this flux is so high and it's so much higher than we think could be attributed to the global ocean? So during my postdoc in Canada, I wanted to look at the North American Arctic Ocean and look over a much larger spatial scale. So again, this is showing the region that Shakova studied. This is the region that I collected data in during my postdoc throughout the North American Arctic Ocean. And I wanted to understand whether this region is emitting methane at similar rates to what's being reported for the East Siberian Arctic shelf. So this is just a map showing all the data that we have. We did over 200 CTD profiles. So we got surface measurements as well as water column measurements to see the vertical structure. Collected over 4 years. The different colors represent how many times we sampled the same station. So we got spatial coverage as well as repeat measurements to observe interannual variability. We did measurements of both methane and nitrous oxide. I'm just going to be talking about the methane today, but you can check out the N2O in the paper. My student Ananga is here as well, and she's also presenting a paper or a poster on N2O this afternoon, so you can check that out as well if you are an N2O fan. So now let's look at the data. So obviously I can't show you all 200 profiles. So what I've done is just merged everything regionally, and so I've separated into 5 different regions that we sampled. So this is the methane concentration in nanomoles per kilogram on the x-axis, and then the y-axis is the potential density anomaly, so that we're grouping similar water masses together. And the dashed line here is atmospheric equilibrium, and then the black line is the median profile. And so based on this, you can see throughout all of our observations, it's very, very close to equilibrium. The highest concentration we saw anywhere is 15 nanomolar, whereas Shakova was reporting values up to 400 nanomolar. So we're definitely not in the East Siberian Arctic shelf. And so I took all of these observations and quantified the methane flux from the North American Arctic Ocean and got a value of 0.09 teragrams of methane per year. And this is accounting for seasonal variability in ice cover. So we're accounting for the fact that during winter, when the Arctic is fully ice covered, there's going to be no gas flux because the ice is acting as a lid, preventing gas transfer. If we have intermediate ice cover, in the marginal ice season, there's going to be an intermediate flux. And it's accounting for seasonal variability and wind speed as well. So obviously this flux is much lower than has been reported for the Siberian Arctic shelf. It's sort of in line with like mean oceanic methane emissions that you'd expect is kind of the average global rate if you were to calculate it like per meter squared. And then just to put this in context, currently anthropogenic emissions of methane are over 300 teragrams of methane. So that's from like fossil fuels, cow farts, all the other sources of methane, over 300 teragrams of carbon. So currently the North American Arctic Ocean is not playing a significant role in the global budget of methane. But I realized that one of the limitations of this data is that we were only collecting measurements in summertime, out in open waters in the minimum ice conditions. And since I just told you that ice acts as a barrier to gas exchange, there would be potential that as the ice is melting, there could be potentially a rapid release of gas. So there could be gases building up underneath the ice over winter and then being ventilated. And so to better understand that, we collected a time series in a community in Nunavut, Canada, Cambridge Bay. So now I'm going to show you some data from there. All right, and so this is showing time series from 2017 and 2018. This data, this time series was led by Professor Brent Elf at the University of Calgary. They were initially planning to do measurements of inorganic carbon parameters, and things like nutrients, chlorophyll. They agreed to also collect methane and N2O samples for us so we could get this really great seasonal time series. This was also kind of a community engaged sampling system where we had local residents collecting samples for us, because you can imagine if we wanted to go out every 2 weeks and collect samples, that would be extremely expensive and burn a lot of methane in the process. So working with community members, they're able to sample for us year round, which is really great. So right now, I'm just showing the data from basically below the mixed layer. So the bottom depth is just below 70 meters, and then tier 10 meters or 7 is just kind of below the mixed layer. And methane is plotted on a log scale, which the reason for that will become clear in a moment. And then I've just put this vertical dashed line to demonstrate the difference between ice-covered conditions, which is where they would sample by drilling a hole through the ice, sending down a Niskin bottle, and then open water conditions, where they would go out on a boat to collect the samples. So it looks like there's not much going on, and you're like, why are you showing me this plot? It looks really boring. But now we can see what's happening in the surface water. So at 2 meters depth, we can see this pulse of methane that occurs just before the ice starts to melt. So these are concentrations up to 900 nanomolar of methane. And then as soon as the ice retreats, the methane concentrations rapidly decrease. So the next question is, what could be the source of this methane? So fortunately, they were also collecting measurements in the river as well that flows into this estuary. This river is fed by a lake, and over the course of the winter, the lake is also ice covered, and part of the lake becomes anoxic and builds up a lot of methane. Then as soon as that river starts to flow in the spring, it transfers that methane-rich water out to the estuary. The estuary is still ice covered, so those really high levels of methane build up under the ice. And then as soon as that ice melts, the methane is rapidly ventilated. And in the river, we were seeing concentrations up to 10,000 nanomolar methane. And so the conclusion from this is that greater than 95% of the annual methane emissions from the estuary result from river discharge. We also did a lot of observations with a robotic vehicle, and there's been a lot more work done by people who are in the audience back in Cambridge Bay, a lot of papers being led by early career scientists. So check out more papers on Cambridge Bay coming, but this just shows that we did measurements with this robotic vehicle over a course of 5 days, and the surface concentrations decreased from 400 to 200 nanomolar over those 5 days. So just like the famous Dua Lipa once sang, I come and I go, catch me or I go Houdini. So now you know why I chose that song, right? If we showed up, the middle of July, we would have completely missed that pulse, and we would have underestimated the methane fluxes from this region. So then I wanted to do a simple scaling experiment just to see, okay, is rivers the difference? Is rivers the answer? Maybe because we weren't accounting for river fluxes in the large scale study that I did, maybe we're underestimating methane fluxes. And so if I just do a simple calculation and assume that all rivers in the whole entire Arctic have the same concentration volume weighted as what we saw in Cambridge Bay, which is around 300 nanomolar, I get a flux of 0.02 teragrams of methane. So still much lower than it has been reported for the East Siberian Arctic shelf. I do have some data from a large river in Russia, which also had very similar concentrations to this. So I don't think this is like a totally unreasonable number. And again, to go from 0.02 teragrams to 17, we would really need to bump up that methane many orders of magnitude. So this comes to the question of why is there such a difference between the sea air fluxes that have been reported for the Siberian Arctic shelf and North America. So one possibility is that it could be benthic fluxes. So I'm going to talk about what I mean by that in a minute. So there's two different mechanisms for gas transfer. The first one is diffusive flux. Hopefully many of you know and love it. Things like the one in COP2014 parameterization. Where we have the flux equal to the gas transfer velocity, which is a function of things like the wind speed or the surface stress, multiplied by the measured concentration minus equilibrium. And so for me, when I'm going out, on a ship to collect measurements, we're measuring a dissolved concentration and then calculating this diffusive flux. But we can have bubble fluxes at this air-sea interface, and we can also have bubbles at the water-sediment interface as well. So bubbles can be injected into water at the surface, but they can also flux out of the sediments. And so when gases become very supersaturated in the sediments, they can no longer stay dissolved and they start to form bubbles. Then those bubbles can rise out of the sediments. So in places where we have a lot of methane production in the sediments, we can have release of those gases to the water column. So let's talk a little bit about how bubbles might behave in water, right? So bubbles can be a really efficient way to transfer gases because they're buoyant, so they want to float towards the surface, whereas a dissolved constituent is going to stay and flow with the water. This is a schematic showing just one model of how bubbles behave in the water column. The x-axis here is the initial bubble diameter, so what size is that bubble when it rises from the sediments. Then the y-axis is the bubble release depth in meters. And then the colors are showing what percentage of that methane at the seafloor reaches the surface. So as those bubbles rise, they're going to start to get smaller and smaller and release their gas to the water column. And then less of that bubble flux is going to make it to the surface. And so we can see kind of for a typical sediment bubble size, we might expect of around 5 millimeters. If the water depth is greater than 60 meters, none of that methane in that bubble is going to make it to the surface as a bubble. It's all going to dissolve. And once it dissolves, that methane can be oxidized with oxygen to CO2, and now it's no longer methane. And so let's see an example of this happening in the Arctic. So as part of this oceanographic time series and observations I did, we also collected some measurements over a known methane seep. And so just to convince you, hopefully, yeah, we're going to see there. So hopefully you'll be able to see some bubbles rising out of the seafloor there. Those are methane-rich bubbles coming out of the sediments. All of the white stuff there is methane oxidizing bacteria. You can see there's some stuff swimming around too. They're really happy to have this source of organic matter. So there's definitely methane bubbling out of the seafloor. They've observed it with ROV. This is a known methane seep. And while they were sitting over the seep, we also collected measurements of methane. And this paper was led by Margaret Cram, who is just finishing up her PhD in the UK. So what do we see when we look at the methane? In the bottom water here, the methane is 609 nanomolar, but then as soon as you go to 200 meters, it's more like 20 nanomolar. And right at the surface, it's very close to equilibrium. So there are bubbles coming out of the sediments, but those bubbles are dissolving as methane. They're no longer bubbles anymore. They're dissolved, and then they're being oxidized to CO2. And since they stuck around on the station a while, they actually did 4 sets of measurements over 25 hours. And so just 14 hours later, the methane concentration in the bottom water has decreased to 60 nanomolar. And then by 25 hours, it was at 9 nanomolar. So some of this is likely temporal variability in how much methane is coming out of the seep. And some of it is very likely also having to do with the seeps being very, very patchy. So if you're on an ROV, you can see the camera footage and you can see, look, there's methane oxidizing bacteria on the seafloor. We're seeing bubbles. Yes, we're on top of the seep. But if you're on a 100-meter long research vessel putting a CTD into the water in the middle of ice cover that you're trying to avoid, it's much more difficult to be on top of the exact same spot every time. So again, as Dua Lipa once said, I come and I go, catch me where I go, Houdini, right? If they had only sampled, at the 25-hour mark, they would have only measured 9 nanomolar rather than 600 in the bottom water. But regardless of what the bottom water concentration is, the concentrations at the surface are very close to equilibrium. So the conclusion is that this seep is really not measurably impacting sea air methane fluxes. But of course, this is a deep sea seep. This is at about 250 meters. So what about methane seeps that are happening in shallower waters, which occurs a lot on the East Siberian Arctic shelf? And so now I'm going to present some data from Thornton et al. That was published in 2020. And this is another method that we can use to look at fluxes of methane. So going out on a ship, you get the concentration of methane that's in your Niskin bottle. Eddy covariance is a way of looking at the methane concentrations or fluxes on the air side. So they're doing really rapid measurements of methane and also wind speed, and that allows them to calculate the flux from the ocean to the atmosphere. And this paper was really significant because it was the first time that any eddy covariance measurements of methane over the ocean had been directly reported. There's lots of people doing this for CO2, but for methane, because the fluxes and concentrations are much lower, you're always very close to the detection limit. And so this is one of the first places where, since the fluxes are higher, they were actually able to detect something above the noise. And they collected data along this transect here, which basically spans a lot of the East Siberian Arctic shelf, right, going all the way from the Kara Sea to the Chukchi Sea. And so what did they calculate? So these little colors here are zooming in on spots where they saw seeps and they saw hotspot fluxes. So I'm just going to show you the results for 2 of those, right? So this is one of the seeps that they sampled over. And there's this one spot where they sampled a flux of 221 milligrams per meter squared per day. But right next to that, only a few kilometers away, the flux is near 0. And then they're seeing the same thing over this other seep as well. So again, these fluxes are very spatially constrained. So again, if you were to go out with a Niskin bottle, you might sample it or you might not. So one of the advantages of the eddy covariance technique is that it accounts for both the bubble-mediated flux and the diffusive flux, since they're measuring the flux on the air side. Whereas if you only sample with a Niskin bottle, you're only measuring what's dissolved and not the bubble flux. Yet, even though they are seeing these strong fluxes from seeps, they concluded because the fluxes from the seeps are very narrowly constrained, at depths greater than 35 meters, which is where they were sampling with this large icebreaker, only 0.04% of the sea air flux occurs directly above seeps. Now, Shakova was sampling mainly in shallower depths, so that may be one of the reasons for the difference. But at least at 35 meters and above, the conclusion is that not much of that seep-derived methane is making it to the atmosphere. And because they're very constrained, right, they're not really contributing too much to the flux. So they still did calculate a relatively high flux from the East Siberian Arctic Shelf in this study of 3 teragrams of methane compared to 17 from Shakova, so it's lower than Shakova, but still much higher than we've calculated for the North American Arctic Ocean. And the last thing I want to finish with is just to say, you can get the meme in a little minute. You got to see a data slide first. Is that overall, so is there a carbon bomb or is it not so strong? So projected global warming, the scientific consensus is that it's likely to induce a gradual and sustained release of carbon from permafrost and methane hydrate, not a carbon bomb. And so if you want more, you can check out any of the references here to get more of kind of a consensus view on that. So to conclude, the first thing I want to say is that methane fluxes from the Arctic Ocean display strong temporal and spatial variability. Thank you, Dua Lipa, for helping me out with that. And also that methane fluxes from the East Siberian Arctic Shelf are much higher than has been reported for the North American Arctic Ocean, but there's no evidence of a catastrophic carbon bomb. What do we need moving forward? So we need more collaboration between groups employing different methods, shipboard, water column measurements, eddy covariance, actually measuring bubbles directly, more studies really spanning the terrestrial and oceanic systems in a wider range of depths, more community-based observations, and continued technology development to facilitate measurements of methane, which is very low. This is my last slide, just to say that, so I'm an assistant professor at UConn. I'm expecting to hire a graduate student for fall 2025, and we're also looking for cruise opportunities. We had some cruises that were canceled due to mechanical issues on a ship, so if you have things that are funded and have berths available, please reach out to me. We don't just measure methane, we measure other gases too. If you understand the song lyric here, come chat with me later. It's Taylor Swift. So I'll just leave that there and take questions.
We have time for a few questions.
Hi, Kara. Great talk. This is Shine Trailer from the MIT Hui Joint Program. I'm curious if you could comment at all on how the air side versus water side fluxes compare, if anyone's looked at that for methane in this environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that the question is kind of how the air side versus water side fluxes compare. The Thornton paper is the first one to actually try to do like direct atmospheric measurements. So obviously they calculated a flux that was lower than Shakova reported, but they were also looking at different waters. So the Shakova paper was actually, they were kind of deliberately targeting seeps as well. So I think that's kind of my point, that it would be really great to do more field campaigns where we're really combining different techniques and trying to compare them for exactly this reason, because there's pros and cons to both. Great question.
Hand over here.
Hi, Kara. Thanks for the great talk. I was curious if, so you talked about how there's not necessarily, like when the ice thaw and then the sea ice melts, there's not necessarily going to be a flux of methane to the atmosphere. Has there been any evidence for like a CO2 outburst from the ocean? And can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the question is about kind of the methane outburst versus CO2. So some people call it the carbon bomb, some call it the methane bomb. Like both of them are important, and there's concern for both that they could result in a rapid warming. Since methane is so much more potent, there's concern that that would really cause this like catastrophic, like really sudden warming. But I think that overall the consensus is like overall in terms of there being this greenhouse gas bomb from the Arctic, the consensus is that that's not going to happen. It's going to be more of a sustained kind of slow release of both CO2 and methane. But there's still a lot more work to be done to understand the relative fluxes of CO2 versus methane, which will obviously impact the heat trapping capacity of that gas a lot. So yeah, good question.
All right, well, thank you. All right, so our next talk is going to be Luke Dykey, coming from Princeton University, and we'll hear more about the bubbles that we got some hints at earlier. So bubble-mediated gas exchange, the ocean-atmosphere interface.
Right. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to talk about our work here. So I'll be talking more about bubbles. I was very happy to see previous talks talking about everything that they do at the ocean-atmosphere interface. I'll be very much focusing on sort of open ocean, deep water conditions in everything that I'm going to be talking about. So it's going to be talking about the role of the bubbles in these open ocean conditions. So the distribution in the sense of bubbles is going to be different. Right. Maybe I need you to, okay, so this is what I'm going to be talking about, right? This is open ocean condition. I'm going to be thinking a lot about sort of moderate to high wind speed, so 10-meter wind speed above 10 meters per second or so, where you see these very nice white caps developing. And so these white caps correspond to patches of bubbles being entrained underwater, and then they spend some time underwater, and then they rise back at the surface where they burst and they produce all the wonderful aerosols that Kim talked about this morning. So that's going to be the idea, right? Constraining this problem and understanding the role of these bubbles on the air-sea fluxes of different gases. And I'm going to be looking at the impact of understanding this for oxygen and CO2 fluxes. So I already mentioned sort of why I started looking at this problem and constraining these fluxes. So it's going to be important for CO2, it's going to be important for oxygen. And a lot of the question has been to constrain the total amount of air being entrained. And then if you look about the sea spread generation side, Kim talked about this morning, and so important for aerosol loading, understanding composition of CCN, and so on and so forth. And so the way I've been looking at this is really sort of trying to understand the physics of the processes, trying to quantify how the wave break, how much air they entrain, and how the bubbles interact with the underwater flow. So that's the sort of general picture. And the question I'm going to be asking is how we can model these processes and what we should take into account to better represent the fluxes between the ocean and the atmosphere. So before I do that, we can go back to, and it's been mentioned a couple of times already in the day, we can go back to how gas transfer is actually modeled in so almost every single model. So you're going to consider you're going to consider the partial pressure difference or the concentration difference between the air side and the water side, and the sign of this difference is going to control the flux, right? So if you have more gas in the air, the gas is going to go in the water, and vice versa. And so that's the formula that's written here, right? With your flux F, that's going to be some transfer velocity or piston velocity times the gas solubility times the partial pressure difference. And so then, if you're talking about the single gas, the whole magic is going to be in this formula, so the one-in-curve type formula, that's going to tell you that your gas transfer velocity scales with the diffusivity, so that's your Schmidt number with the minus 1/2 exponent, and then the wind speed to some exponent, usually 2. And so the first question that I sort of posed when I started working on this was, okay, is this representation, is this parametrization as a function of just wind speed and only the gas diffusivity going to be good enough to describe the gas exchange? So then you have tons of measurements of eddy covariance and also tracer that allow you to backtrack this transfer velocity, which is plotted here, this KW. It's normalized by the Schmidt number so that you can supposedly compare different gases, or at least different temperature for the same gases. And then it's wind speed here. And so then the black line is the one-in-curve formula with a certain prefactor. And again, that's what's being used in most gas exchange, most ocean model or climate model. And then all the data are different results from eddy covariance measurement of CO2 fluxes. And so then you get your gas transfer velocity. And so what you can see is that if you take a specific wind speed at 10 meter or 15 meter or whichever you want, you see a very large spread in the data up to a factor 2 or 3. And that spread can be traced back to the role of the wave in the dynamic and the role of the wave and training bubbles, and these bubbles modulating ART fluxes. So that's a sort of a first. This is not like a new message, right? It's something that's been written many times in many papers, that this variability, if you care about really locally at high frequency, what your flux is going to be important, and you're going to have to account for wave information. So that's one point. The second point is if you think about low solubility gases, such as oxygen, you can convince yourself that the C state is only going to be one part of the story. You also need to account for small bubbles that are going to fully dissolve and that are going to drive supersaturation of the gas. And this is really nicely demonstrated in a set of paper from Rachel, doing measurements of noble gas supersaturation in the field and more recently in the lab. And that shows systematic supersaturation in the water. So the fact that you put a lot of tiny bubbles in the water, the bubbles are going to get trapped in the water, they're going to fully dissolve, and so they are going to drive supersaturation. And again, it's not really a new message, right? If you go back to the paper from Ralph Keeling in the 90s or David Wolf in the 90s, it's like already mentioned. It's already like sort of they're already posing the equations that you need to model these processes, and then it becomes a question of how do you constrain the formula that were proposed at the time. So what I'm going to argue in the rest of the talk is how we should actually model the gas exchange processes. So I'm going to break the fluxes into three pieces. The first piece is the exchange through an unbroken surface. So that's going to be like your classic diffusive exchange, nothing to do with bubbles. It's going to be writing your flux as a piston velocity, a transfer velocity times solubility times the partial pressure difference. The second term that I'm going to be talking about is using the terminology from Keeling's paper, the large bubble. So the large bubble, they're untrained, they spend a finite amount of time in the water, and then they go back at the surface. And then again, your flux is going to be some transfer velocity. It's not going to be the same as the unbroken condition, times solubility times partial pressure difference. And then the third term is going to be the small bubbles. The small bubbles, they are going to fully dissolve in the water. And so this flux term is going to be quite different from the previous one, right? Because while the first two are symmetric, right? So they are going to follow the sign, they are going to follow the partial pressure difference. More gas in the air, the gas goes in the water. More gas in the water, the gas gets out. This one is going to be asymmetric. It's only going to go in the water, right? Because your small, if they fully dissolve in the water column, they don't care whether there was more gas or less gas on the other side. And so that one is going to be able to drive a supersaturation in a particular way. And the thing to keep in mind is that this is going to be important depending on the solubility of the gas, because it's going to depend on how much you're far from saturation and how much time it takes to equilibrate. So if you are considering a very soluble gases like DMS, then you really don't care too much about bubbles. If you go to CO2, then you're going to have to care about the large bubbles. And if you go to something like oxygen, then you're going to have to care about the three pieces of the puzzle. And it's the paper from Atamanchuk in 2020 sort of illustrated the potential impact of this very nicely by considering partial pressure data of CO2 and O2 during a set of winter storm. And then they took their data and then they considered two different formulations from the literature, one in cuff type formulation that is completely symmetric, and one from Rachel that has an asymmetric component. And so what they show is that in certain storms, so if you take like these ones, for example, so in certain conditions, the small bubbles were able to revert the flux, right? So even if the partial pressure difference would tell you the flux should go one way, the presence of the small bubbles was actually reverting the sign, which, I mean, if you think about it locally, that's a pretty big deal. And if you average, if these sorts of events are happening regularly, then again, that might be important from a budget point of view. But again, and it's sort of the question that this paper poses is like, okay, which formulation do you want to take? How do you constrain the coefficients that are in your formulation? Okay, so that's what I'm going to do and show some impact in the remaining 10 minutes or so. I'm going to walk you through sort of theoretically for each of these types of fluxes, how you write them, and then I'm going to tell you which data you can use to constrain them. And then I'm going to apply this to CO2 and oxygen by implementing these formulation into a global ocean model and discussing some impact. And the point is that for each of these steps, you're going to use different types of data, right? So if you want to constrain the flux of an unbroken surface, then you're going to use a high solubility gas, and you're going to be able to use either lab or field data. If you want to constrain the large bubbles, you're going to have to use CO2 fluxes. And then if you want to constrain the small bubbles, then we're going to use noble gas supersaturation data from Rachel. So that's the plan. So we can start with the unbroken surface. So you consider a surface, and you can go back to textbooks in the 60s that tell you something that's called eddy renewal theory. So you have a certain condition in concentration in the air and in the water, and because your water side is turbulent, what's going to control the flux is the renewal time. So the renewal time at the surface, right? So if it was purely diffusive, it would be much lower, but because the water has some turbulent motion, and this turbulence motion constantly bring back fresh water at the surface that can flux out or in. And so you can take the words I just said and transform this into an equation, and it gives this formula here that depends on a turbulence parameter, the turbulence dissipation rate. And if you want to transfer this to something that we like, we can transform this by making the connection that this parameter here scales with the friction velocity. And so you end up with a formulation that has only one free parameter, which is this constant that you're going to have to constrain with data. Okay, so that's one stuff. Then the second part would be to constrain the large bubbles. And so then you can go to the paper from Ralph Keeling in the 90s that basically did this. So you write your large bubble flux, and you're going to say that these bubbles are going to exchange gas while they spend time underwater. And so the way you write this equation is saying that this transfer velocity is a volume of air that's going to exchange divided by the gas solubility. Alpha is the Oswald solubility. And this is going to depend on a bunch of terms. It's going to depend on your bubble sizes, so RV or your bubble sizes. You're going to integrate over all the bubble sizes. So you're going to need to know the bubble size distribution. That's going to be a very important parameter of the model to constrain. And then you're going to need to constrain what Ralph called an exchange efficiency, which depends on how much time the bubble spends in the water. So it's going to depend on how deep you put the bubble and how fast it rises back. And all of this you can sort of study in the lab or numerically. And what's important is that if you use these equations and then you put reasonable estimates and you compute for various gases, you're going to get a relationship with diffusivity and solubility. So this theoretical framework is going to naturally give you a dependency in solubility or diffusivity. So the way we have been approaching this to constrain this model is to sort of split the scales of the ocean in 3 steps. On one side, understanding air entrainment and wave breaking to sort of know for specific wind and wave conditions how much waves are breaking and how many bubbles are being entrained. Study wave breaking at the individual scales through simulation and lab work, and then study the bubble processes. So the gas exchange would be this snippet, and then we also use this framework for sea spray. So I'm not going to talk in detail about the sorts of individual fluid mechanics, but that's what we have done in my group for the last 6 to 7 years. And so sort of each scale has been taken up independently, trying to constrain the relevant parameter, and then trying to fold back to compute the total amount of gas exchange. And so if you take all of these pieces of work together, you go back into writing your integrals with a few more terms, and you can. This is, again, just the breakdown inherited from Keeling's formulation, and then you can transform all of this complexity into a small number of parameters that you can keep track of, and so you can focus on the side that's here. So you have a dependency in solubility that you have obtained from the model, from the finite residence time of the bubble. You have a dependency in the diffusivity, that's your Schmidt number here, and then you have a dependency in wind and waves
wind and sea space. And this is equivalent to the Whitecap coverage formulation that you have in some papers. And so that's sort of the whole game. And at the end of the day, you have this formula, and you can just focus on constraining a prefactor against field measurements of CO2 fluxes and CO2 gas transfer velocity. And so that's what we did. On the left, you have the classic KW plot with like a lot of scatter depending on the data. And then if you change the axis instead of the wind speed, having this mixed wind and wave variable, then you sort of collapse the data to a certain extent. And so you represent part of your variability due to the waves into this relatively simple formulation. Okay, so this is what we did for CO2. Again, we have a formulation that if you change the gas, you can predict what's going to be your transfer velocity at the same wind speed for different types of gases. And so that is something that you can then feed to a global ocean model. And so that's what we did, working with Gore at Princeton and then with Brendan at NOAA at GFDL. We implemented this for CO2 into the coupled ocean biogeochemistry model. The wind is forced through a wind product, and the wave information was computed previously through a separate run. So at every time when we do this ocean model calculation, we go on a table and we pick the corresponding wave, and you get this sort of nice map where you see that instead of having just the red or just the blue curve, which would be a single value of the gas transfer velocity at a particular wind speed, you have a whole spread which is indicated with the bluish colors. And so Paridi, who is a grad student working with Gore, has been analyzing these simulations and comparing different scenarios to look at the impact for CO2 fluxes and for the carbon storage. And to make a long story short, what you see is that the sea state variability induces variation in your gas transfer velocity at places that have the same wind speed but different wave properties. And so that has an impact on the CO2 fluxes, where you see that a certain region of uptake are being reinforced and certain region of uptake are being suppressed, and the other way around, depending on whether you are sheltered or not by the coast and whether or not you have high wave activity at a particular wind speed. And so they are sort of analyzing the impact of this in terms of storage and in terms of composition of the water mass. Okay. So this is the story for CO2 and the sea state induced variability when we account for these large bubbles. And now I would like to extend this framework to low solubility gases such as oxygen. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use the data that Rachel published and collected through lab experiments in Sustain. So Sustain is a high wind speed facility in Miami. So they performed experiments where they ran the wind at a very high value, basically creating a flow that's completely saturated in bubbles. And so I'm going to attribute this whole supersaturation to the fact that bubbles dissolve in the water. And so here you have a plot showing the supersaturation as a function of the gas solubility, the Ostwald solubility, and it's for a bunch of noble gases. And you see that your supersaturation starts around 9% and goes down to a few percent, and O2 and CO2 are indicated. They are not measured, but it's just to give you an idea of where they would land on this plot. And so we are going to try I'm going to use these data to constrain my model and understand this dependence in solubility. So again, we go back to Ryle's paper and we pull out the information that we need. So to understand this asymmetric flux, these small bubbles, like part of it is going to come from the large bubbles getting squeezed by hydrostatic pressure, and part of it is going to come by the small bubbles getting fully dissolved. And so you need to make a bunch of assumptions of which bubbles are fully dissolved. And if you do this and you use the same input as in the previous condition, you can explain the graph from Rachel's data. So the black are the data, the red is the theory, the circles give you the supersaturation coming from both large bubbles getting squeezed and small bubbles fully dissolving. If you look at the match with the data is pretty good. what you see is you need both contribution, right? If you only take the squares, then you have something that doesn't depend much on solubility, but the small bubbles that fully dissolve depend a lot on solubility. And so if you consider both contribution, you're able to recover this observed scaling from the lab. You can actually understand it if you nail down how different terms in your theory scale with solubility. So we are very happy with this. You can actually also make the flux work. I'm going to skip that slide because of time. But you can also realize that you get the flux right in the experiment. So now that we have done it for the experiment, we're going to go and implement this into MOM6. So I've constrained almost everything. If you followed me properly, you might have realized that there is a constant that I haven't constrained. And so we are going to do a bit of trial and error to get that constant be reasonable. But again, remember 2 pieces to the flux. One part is symmetric, one part is asymmetric, and they depend. They have a dependence on solubility, and the asymmetric part has a very strong dependence on solubility. So this one for CO2, you're not going to care too much, but for oxygen, you're not going to care a lot about it. And so we ran for we ran a set of simulation with the wind only gas transfer parameterization, and then the wind and wave, small and large bubbles. And so the maps are fairly similar, right? This is the seasonal average over 5 years. The maps look quite similar, but if you look at the difference, you actually have pretty significant differences at high latitude that depend on the seasonality, because it depends very much on the partial pressure of oxygen. So you have a strong influence of adding this term to the flux. And then if you do a global average and you hope you're going into the right direction, if you take the data set from Ito et al. And you average over this particular period of time, because that's what we have for now and we're working on more years, they have a number in terms of oxygen loss that is smaller than what you would get with, at least in the model we're running, in the global ocean model we're running, that's significantly smaller than what you get if you use the classic one-in-cup approach. If we use my formulation, but without the small bubbles, you get something very similar to the one-in-cup one. But now if you add the small bubble, you sort of get back to something, you get to something that might be compatible to the data. So hopefully this is going to be useful to understand oxygen processes. And so with this, thanks a lot for your attention.
Hi, interesting talk. This is a naive question, but how do you get at the wave cover in a global model and the white caps associated with those?
Right. So you run separately a wave model. So you take wind forcing, you have operational wave model that you just run the waves. So they are forced by the wind, and you solve for the wave, and you run them through the historical period where you have a wind forcing. Then you keep that data of the wave and you store that data, and then when you run your ocean model, you call the wave information. To your second question, the white cap coverage is basically, in my formulation, that part of the formula, where it is. The white cap coverage is basically this dependency. So if you take white cap coverage and you plot a line that scales with U star to this power times significant wave height to that power, you're going to describe white cap coverage reasonably well, and it's yeah. So that's where it is.
So Jerry Wigger, University of Southern Miss. The question I have relates to that because we're running models now with wind wave interaction. Have you got any sense for how that would flow into this?
Yeah, I mean, what we are doing, we're just doing it because GFDL hasn't fully coupled the ocean and the wave yet. So once they have done it, then we will do it in an interactive way. It was a way to start doing the impact on the ocean or CO2 fluxes and storage before that full coupling was operational. So you can use this in a fully coupled framework, in a seamless way.
And we have a question online that Heather will read.
I have 2 I'm going to sneak in. One from Ingeborg Bussman. Thank you for your talk. How would you estimate the necessity to use the bubble models for coastal methane? That's the first question. And the second question is, do surfactants have an influence? That's from Rick Wanikoff.
Great. Yeah. So, okay. So I'm going to go back to one of the other equations, guys. Okay. So for methane, this here, my line in blue, is the size distribution of the bubbles. And so that one, through extensive studies in the lab or in the field, you sort of have a constraint on what the shape of that distribution is in the open ocean. For methane, if the bubbles are coming like what Kara was showing from the soil, the size distribution is going to be different. So if you know the size distribution, you can use that sort of framework. You just have to change this input parameter in the theoretical model for the bubbles, and you should be able to compute that flux well. I mean, there is no reason. The second question about surfactants is a great one. So surfactants, if you are completely covered with if you completely cover your surface by surfactants, you're going to reduce the gas exchange. And so you're basically going to reduce, and you're also going to change the rise velocity. So you're going to change these two input parameters here. So, so you can keep that framework and basically have an extra input variable, which would be surfactant coverage, whatever that would be. And then you would feed that information into a reduced rise velocity or reduced gas transfer velocity individually for the bubbles. So it's possible to incorporate, but it's not done at all. But you would need something about the coverage of surfactants, which...
That's going to be it for now, but Luke is here all week, so you can ask him more questions later. And now we're going to have our... Yeah. We're going to have our lightning talks, and if the speaker is going to come down. So.
Yes, we have 4 more lightning talks for you. As the name implies, these will be fast, illuminating, and electrifying, so get prepared. Each lightning speaker, please introduce yourself when you come up to the podium.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Sounds like it. My name is Una Miller. I'm a postdoc working at University of Rhode Island with Jamie Palter and also this wonderful group of scientists from various institutions. I'm going to tell you in the next 5 minutes about why you should care about air-sea interaction occurring in the Labrador Sea. So we'll start by orienting ourselves. This is the subpolar North Atlantic. This is Canada, this is Greenland, Iceland, and this is the UK. This region is important, not least because it's where the overturning in the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, occurs. Water passes through this region in a series of boundary currents. So you have warm, salty water coming up from the Gulf Stream, passing up and in and around the Nordic Seas, down in and around Greenland, through Labrador Sea, and exiting out as a much denser, colder water mass. This transformation from less dense to more dense is that overturning circulation. And this is important because this water exiting as a dense water mass fills that bottom limb of AMOC. If you're familiar with OSNAP, this was a program that instrumented the boundary currents in this region to quantify the strength of AMOC. You'll know that one of the major findings is that much of this overturning occurs east of Greenland and that the Labrador Sea has actually very little effect on the density of water moving through. However, there's another reason that Labrador Sea appears to be important, and that's shown in this figure. This is an oxen transect of the Labrador Sea and a bit of the Erminger from 2014. And I want you to focus on this water mass here. This is Labrador Sea water. This is a water mass formed by deep convection occurring when cold winds come off the continent, cause extensive heat loss, convection down to 1,000 meters or deeper, which then brings deep oxygen-depleted waters up to the surface where they can exchange a lot of oxygen with the atmosphere. So that results in a very highly oxygenated Labrador Sea water layer. And the other thing I want to point out here is that in this sort of transect view, which aligns with this black line here, this is a boundary current coming in, so right here, and this is a boundary current coming out. And I'd like you to notice that the boundary current coming in is much less oxygenated than that coming out. So that's painting the picture that the Labrador Sea is inputting a lot of oxygen into these waters before they exit the subpolar North Atlantic. Now I'd like to introduce GOSNAP. This is, the acronym is mostly OSNAP plus G for gases. And the goal of GOSNAP is to quantify this oxygenation that's occurring in the Labrador Sea. So it did that by putting 60 optodes on the OSNAP array, so the arrays in the boundary currents of the Labrador Sea and part of the Erminger, from 2020 to 2022, giving us 2 years of high quality, full water column depth oxygen time series in this critical region. And if you're curious how we calibrated them, please come find me later. I have a preprint of a methods paper that I can share with you. So we have these discrete measurements, and we'd like to go from discrete time series to a nice gridded oxygen product so that we can ultimately calculate oxygen transports. I won't go into details, but we go from discrete measurements to gridded oxygen by using a random forest trained on mooring data. And if you'd like to know more about how we do that, please find Ellen Park. She's here all week. So we take this gridded oxygen, multiply it by the OSNAP gridded velocity product, and then that gives us oxygen transports in the Labrador Sea. And that's what I'll show in this last slide. So this is oxygen transport calculated from our measurements, integrated across the full Labrador Sea. So transport on the y-axis was negative, being net export out of the Labrador Sea. And I've colored it by each year of the 2-year deployment. There's a lot of interesting variability that we could get into, both monthly, seasonally, and even a little bit of interannually. But I won't go into that now. For now, I'd just like you to notice that virtually always the Labrador Sea is exporting oxygen. And this tells us, and actually at a rate of an average of 33 teramoles per year. So this is sort of quantifying the fact that the Labrador Sea really puts in a large amount of oxygen into the system that ultimately passes water into the bottom limb of the North Atlantic, or of the AMOC, which then fills much of the Atlantic with oxygen, supporting marine ecosystems, fisheries. And just for a bit of context, the 33 teramoles, that's about an order of magnitude larger than the estimated biological consumption rate that occurs downstream in the Labrador seawater layer of the North Atlantic. So the big takeaway here is that this seasonal deep convection in the Labrador Sea that allows for so much oxygen uptake oxygenates this outgoing limb of the deep outgoing limb of the AMOC. And the bigger, broader implication is that if much of the ventilation of the system is occurring in the Labrador Sea, whereas much of the overturning is occurring in the east of Greenland, then these two things are decoupled, which is going to be interesting for our understanding of how they'll change in the future. So please come find me at my poster. Thank you so much.
Okay, so hi, I'm John Lauderdale. I'm a research scientist at MIT, and I'm going to be talking about the relationship between upwelling and CO2 fluxes in the Southern Ocean. So there's 2 papers that I've been kind of inspired by recently. One was Brady in 2021, where they released a bunch of particles in the Southern Ocean, throughout the Southern Ocean at various depths, and then tracked where they upwelled towards the near surface. So the dots on this grey map, the grey dots on this map over here, are showing where the particles are crossing the 200-meter threshold. And then the second product was the sort of BGC Argo weighted air-sea CO2 fluxes from Seth Brzezinski, which are shown on this map. So the blue is outgassing and the red is uptake. I've kind of binned the particles in different latitudes. So here's the longitude plot there. And one of the conclusions from Brady was that the particles are really upwelling in topographic regions. And so from depth, so one might think that that would be carrying a signature of high abyssal carbon waters, and that might lead to significant air-sea CO2 fluxes. However, if you look at the particularly outgassy map from Seth's paper, you can kind of see that the Southern Ocean is generally all outgassy, and there doesn't appear to be that much correlation between the upwelling locations and the air-sea CO2 fluxes. On my poster, there's a bit more detailed analysis. But anyway, so I was trying to mash up a bunch of different observations, GLODAP and World Ocean Atlas and stuff like that to try and get at the different processes that are driving the air-sea CO2 fluxes. But that turned out to be a real mess. So more recently, I've been working with data assimilative biogeochemistry and ecosystem state estimate, Echo Darwin. And I thought, great, well, that will show me what processes are occurring in the Southern Ocean. So here's this breakdown. So there's a method that I developed in 2016 where you can break down the CO2 flux into a flux that depends on temperature, a flux that depends on the combined effect of fresh water on DIC alkalinity and salinity, a flux that depends on biological activity, and a flux that depends on this disequilibrium term. And in the Southern Ocean, the disequilibrium term is largely associated with the upwelling of deep ocean abyssal carbon. Great, okay. Because it's in Echo Darwin, it assimilates all the available observations that we have, including GLODAP and BGC Argo. So within the constraints of the model, this is kind of as close to the database estimate that I was trying to recreate from the product. So what you can see is actually that Echo Darwin is not as outgassy as the Bashinsky product. But we can still use these drivers to see the processes that are occurring. If I do the same thing, averaging it into the longitudinal bins, what you can see is I did a tracer release experiment. So instead of doing particles, I did tracers at various different locations throughout the Southern Ocean. Here are the numerous traces that those tracer looks like at the 200-meter level. The black line is the topography. And the first thing you can see is that in some locations, you get high tracer concentrations where you'd expect it with the sort of shoaling topography. In other locations, such as the Campbell Plateau and the Drake Passage, where the topography is shallow, actually, particularly here, you get very low tracer concentrations. So that might sort of think, okay, well, what's going on here? If you look at the disequilibrium, this is showing you where that upwelling is occurring. And again, in the Campbell Plateau, the Kerguelen Plateau, and Crozet, you can see that there are peaks in the disequilibrium outgassing. So that's kind of this abyssal CO2 coming up the surface. It's a bit more complicated in Drake Passage. It looks like it's kind of occurring just before the topography really kicks in. So that could be a signal either of strong divergence, which is where the really sort of swift currents are taking the CO2 or taking the upwelled carbon away from those locations, but you're still getting the upwelling signature. It could be other factors that are coming into it. What you can also see is that there are opposing processes. Upwelling brings nutrients to the surface, so you get this biological compensation. And so that is possibly why the signal is not necessarily, the net flux is not necessarily so correlated with the upwelling location. I've got a poster later today. Come and talk to me if you're interested.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Beida. I am a postdoc working at Princeton with collaborators from NOAA GFDL. So the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about the drivers of global river carbonate system and what's the impact of river de-acid alkalinity on coastal air CO2 flux estimates from global model. So one of the motivations of our study here is that many global models used in like CMIP 5, CMIP 6, they don't really have a realistic river de-acid alkalinity input. Instead, either set the concentration to 0 or just use one single value across board. So that's why we wanted to use available river chemistry data to develop a new, more complete river alkalinity and de-acid concentration for future global model simulation. We started by compiling the river chemistry data showed by the map here. We can see that there's a large spatial variability in river alkalinity. So for each location in the river, there's a corresponding watershed region. So the river alkalinity is fundamentally driven by bedrock geology and also like soil types and vegetation, all sorts of things. So what we tried was to use multilinear regression to see if we can correlate river alkalinity observations to watershed information. So first we try. So if we only use one watershed property, we found that the forest coverage over the watershed can give a pretty good estimate of river alkalinity, can explain over 50% of the spatial variability. And then we can try to add more watershed information. The combination of carbonic rock and the forest gives the best estimates if we only use two predictors. Similarly, by adding annual mean precipitation over the watershed can give us can further improve the estimates of alkalinity from this multilinear regression. So these three predictors gives a pretty good estimate for most of the region. However, it really overestimates river alkalinity in high latitude regions. That's why we dig more into the data and found that if we add in permafrost coverage and glacier cover within the watershed, this can give much better estimates of alkalinity in the river in high latitude regions. So overall, we ended up with this 5 predictor multilinear regression relationship. and explains over 70% of the alkalinity variability in the river. Using these relationships and the coefficient, we try to calculate river alkalinity concentration for all the major rivers globally, using the coefficient and also the watershed information for each of the river. We used a similar method to estimate global river DSC and DSC to alkalinity ratio, but I won't go into too much detail here. With these two products, we ran some global model simulation, and then try to look at what's the change in coastal air CO2 flux when if we use different river forcing. So this slide here, if I want to navigate you to the first two bars first, these are from a recent study by Laura Flendy at Princeton. So the first bar here shows the observation-based coastal CO2 estimate, observation-based coastal CO2 uptake. And the second bar here is the global model-based CO2 uptake in coastal ocean. So we can see that global model in general overestimates the CO2 flux in coastal water. And then we tried our newly developed river DSC and alkalinity from multilinear regression. We compared to the case where we don't have any river DSC and alkalinity, that can decrease the coastal CO2 uptake by 0.1 petagram carbon per year, which is about 50% of the bias we see here. Of course, there are many other reasons why there's a difference between observation-based and model-based estimates, but we hope this like more realistic river forcing we created here can be helpful to address some of the bias. So here's just some take-home message. We used the watershed information and several basic watershed properties can really give us a good estimate of global river alkalinity concentration, and using this more realistic concentration can decrease the bias we see in global model. So I have a poster. If you are interested in more of this work, please stop by. And we also, in our group, we also have another poster looking at how iron fertilization impacts carbon uptake efficiency. So thank you.
So I'm Alan. I'm a scientist at WHOI. And today, on behalf of this list of co-authors you see here, I'm pleased to present sort of an interesting, fun story about noble gases in the deep Pacific and what they can tell us about air-sea gas exchange in deep water formation regions. And so before I start, I want to sort of thank and acknowledge our funding from NSF Chemical Oceanography as well as support from GeoTraces. So really, there's only one thing to pay attention to in this talk, right? This is the only parameter I think I'll be showing, which is delta. It's a percent difference from equilibrium. It's a disequilibrium. And it's a difference between an observed concentration of a gas, say xenon in the deep ocean, from the value you'd expect at solubility equilibrium at a given potential temperature and salinity, and assuming 1 atmosphere pressure, right? So it's just a percent deviation from equilibrium. So here we're looking at neon, argon, krypton, and xenon, which are, of course, inert noble gases in the atmosphere. They're really great tracers of physics, and they tell us about past air-sea exchange because they are non-reactive, they're not radioactive, they're not radiogenic, and they don't have any sinks or sources in the ocean. And so they enter the ocean through air-sea exchange in deep water formation regions, right? And so their disequilibria, this delta, right, in the ocean interior and the deep ocean, reflects only physical processes that must have occurred at the sea surface at the time and place of deep water formation. And so over the last 10 or 15 years, we've gotten much better at measuring noble gases and their disequilibria in the ocean interior. We've learned a lot, but there was a really unique opportunity to sort of gain some new insight into the structure of noble gas disequilibria on a recent GeoTraces cruise. This is the GP15 section from about 20 south up to 55 north along 150 west in the Pacific. And so here I'm going to look at the deep noble gas disequilibria along this transect. And so here's all of the data first, right? And so on the left, you can see concentrations of xenon in the deep ocean below 1 kilometer. On the right, concentrations of neon below 1 kilometer. And in black, you can see what we expect at equilibrium. Right? And so there's a persistent disequilibrium and undersaturation of xenon, 2% on average, and a supersaturation of neon. And this is really consistent with what we've learned over the last decade or two from the rest of the ocean, that there's a consistent undersaturation of heavy noble gases. That's basically due to competition between cooling rates during deep water formation, gas exchange rates. And then a supersaturation of light noble gases, and that's really due to bubble injection, so very much related to what Luke was talking about a few minutes ago. So, but here for the first time, I think we can really dig into this and say, along this big gradient in space and a corresponding gradient in water mass age, do we see meaningful differences beyond just this pattern of undersaturation and supersaturation? And so since I guess I probably have like 1 minute left, we'll just jump to the answer, which is that yes, there is a spatial trend. It's incredibly consistent between these four gases. So it ranges from about 0.2 to 0.3% from the South Pacific to the North Pacific, again, all in the deep ocean. The North Pacific's, of course, older, right? And so what this sort of implies is that there's some age gradient of equal magnitude for all of these gases in their disequilibria that occur during deep water formation. And so I don't have time to go into all the mechanisms, but basically the only thing we can think of that can produce an equal magnitude increase in disequilibrium for all four of these gases is a simple change in barometric pressure. So the implication here is that if there's an increase from south to north, and the north, of course, has older waters, this must imply a long-term decline in sea level pressure that's prevailing during deep water formation, probably around Antarctic bottom water formation regions. And so, so we worked with Jake Gebbe and used an inverse model to sort of unmix these waters, right, and take this signal from noble gases about sea level pressure, convolved with information about water mass age, to sort of back out this change, this long-term decline in sea level pressure. It's large in amplitude, which is interesting. We don't think it reflects sort of large-scale mean changes or annual mean changes in like the depth of the circumpolar trough, but probably something that's local that's happening during these deep water formation events, possibly driven by katabatic wind enhancement and larger plinias over the last 2,000 years. So I'll end there, and if you're curious, we published a really short sort of paper in Nature Geoscience earlier this year that might be worth checking out. Thanks.
Okay, so now we have our discussion. We have those guiding questions I gave you a little warning about in the beginning. So those are guiding questions, and the discussion's really supposed to be a discussion, not necessarily a question and answer. So our wonderful speakers will give their insights if you have questions, but also please feel free just to say your own thoughts, your own sort of findings, what you think is important. So as a reminder, the three questions we're going to talk about, and maybe we'll focus on the first two, are what are some ways to bridge gaps in our current understanding of air-sea interactions? And how should we best integrate measurements, process understanding, new paradigms, and models in order to bridge these gaps? And before anybody raises their hand, just to get some of our early career people speaking, I'd like to open by having students and postdocs. So for the first few minutes, if there's any students and postdocs want to ask a question along these lines to our speakers, want to give their own insights, what they think some big gaps are, or some good ways of integration, please raise your hand.
Hi, Colette Kelly from Hui. I have a question for Luke. So you probably already touched on this, but I was wondering how your method differs from or builds on that Liang 2013 work that also separates out large and small bubbles.
Right. So there are lots of similarities. All the physical constraints on air entrainment and all of that are actually very similar and compatible. The sort of methodological difference is that the way he then gets to fluxes is by running a very high resolution LES type model. And then from that, he extrapolates what should be implemented. We did comparison about specifically for oxygen, specifically what the numbers he's proposing, how it's different from ours, and I forget, but it's not that far off. There are some differences, but it's not that. I would say what you can't do if you read Jun Hong's paper is apply it to another gas. You don't have the extrapolation for any other gases. Like you have the sets of gases that he has considered, and then he's giving you the formula you should use. But if you're interested in something else than whatever you considered, then you would have to rerun the model and all of that. Like they haven't constrained how it depends on solubility and diffusivity. for everything I talked about, it's really solubility that dominates. And so that was sort of what I was really after thought in there is also like there are hundreds of papers that propose these formula, but each time you change gases, people tend to retune the coefficient, and I would like to be done and not tune the coefficient forever. That was sort of.
Other questions, comments, ideas?
Sasha Kramer and Bari. I have a question mostly for Douglas, but I think it also applies to a lot of people. I was so excited about your talk. I absolutely loved it. And I'm really excited that people are thinking more about this connection between wildfires and ocean life. Something that I noticed is that, I mean, I know this from my own experience, you talked about this, we're very data limited with studying this issue. And so we kind of have these case studies, and sometimes it's serendipitous where we have measurements already ongoing and we can put things together and use things like satellite data, which maybe with a wildfire is particularly complicated. But maybe getting at this first question about ways to bridge gaps, what would be for you like an ideal way for us to be better at having more in situ data or more existing ways to study these types of issues, particularly in coastal areas where we're really concerned about those potential impacts?
Okay, wow, lots to unpack there. I'm glad you enjoyed the talk. So one of the things maybe I'll just say straight off the bat is that I'm very excited about PACE and the potential applications of PACE. Yay! Well done, everybody, on getting that launched. Yeah, I think that these kinds of pieces of technology can really help us in understanding the impacts from different aerosol sources. And some of the things that I found most interesting is this kind of almost differential response of the phytoplankton communities to these different sources, but that's in the model. So I want to know, okay, so we've got this in the modeling world, from the observational world, do we see this as well? And I know that there's some evidence of that kind of coming out from the California coast that potentially we are seeing that. I think PACE can really help there. I think there's potentially also room for expanding potentially the autonomous vehicles as well, and the Argo network. Can we help do some more there, making them more kind of aerosol aware, or thinking about what else we can do from that autonomous network? And then finally, like, where I'm in my own wheelhouse is the Earth system models. So we spent a lot of time now developing the Earth system models to be able to characterize these kind of atmospheric components. The oceanographers, the biogeochemistry spent a lot of time characterizing the ocean side of things. And we now have a tool, but we haven't actually fully coupled and run that yet as a full suite. So we're at the cusp now of being able to kind of couple these different environments within the model and actually see those feedbacks and see what kind of comes out and see what's exciting. And I'm very much looking forward to doing that. So I think there's lots of things. There's remote sensing, some great things, some autonomous vehicle, maybe potentially, and then using the Earth system models to their full capacity will be very, very nice to see.
Does anybody else want to add in? Other questions, ideas, comments?
Hello, Luai from Woods Hole here. I have a question for Stephen. Your talk, I think a lot about elemental stoichiometry in the ocean, and your talk really messed with my head a bit. Do you think it's time to revisit the Redfield ratio again to kind of incorporate these microplastic elements to the ratio?
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's a great question. There's a few ways I think we need to think about it. One is that, again, atoms move, they react, transform by standard processes and interact with the energy around them. So if we observe these variations that are due to plastics, we can't assume that we can ignore it, not just from the fact that it makes an artifact, but this is the state of our planet today. So I don't think we can just discard it and correct it and move on. This is affecting, I think, pretty much every observation that we make. So if you think it's just about abundance, it's not. These substances interact with their environment and transform their properties. So if it's the microlayer, it might be affecting the properties you care about in the microlayer. And in terms of the stoichiometry, I guess for me, I mean, I don't know how to say it. You're all extraordinary people in this room, and you're more clever than me and more knowledgeable in your own fields. I'm sure you're much more knowledgeable about this than I am. So part of it is reducing down the uncertainties and thinking about what ultimately matters. My process is always, again, air propagation to see if it can be measured and then finding the most efficient and accurate way to get at it. So it comes down to, I guess, two quotes from Ernest Rutherford, who was clearly a very popular man today, to quote. But one is, we're out of money, we've got to think, right? That requires creativity. And the other is, if you need statistics, you design a different experiment. And the clever one that I think of is, you know, doing something at a time that was revolutionary and scary, figuring out what an alpha particle is. Design this experiment where the particles would diffuse through a bulb, get trapped in an outer sphere, and if it was helium, now we know what the alpha particle is. Doing something in a way that no one else had done, but an elegant way that eliminated the uncertainty. And if we get this better distribution, everything is a distribution, we might have a better handle on how the Earth works, predictions about what will happen in the future, but also predictions about how the Earth behaved in the past. So I mean, I leave this up to creative people like you to take the helm and world better. That's okay with you, yeah.
I just had a follow-up. Another famous quote by Rutherford was, the only real science is physics. Everything else is stamp collecting. Actually, I had a wildfire question. A lot of fires, especially here in the United States, are inland somewhere. And so it seems like their impact on the ocean might be more significant in terms of how they affect, like, post-fire weathering in the watershed, river chemistry, that kind of thing, as much as the atmospheric inputs. And I'm just wondering if you guys that care about wildfires have sort of given much attention to that.
Yeah, so when we combust, or not we, but when the fire combusts the vegetation, there's a wide range of different products that you're going to get from that combustion. And what I'm really talking about in my talk today is kind of the smaller particle sizes, so the aerosols were under 10 microns, and then those are easily lofted into the atmosphere, and then they can be transported long range away, and that's when you're going to get that kind of impact in the remote ecosystems. And more for the watersheds, it's going to be like the larger size particle, the ash or the char that's kind of left over, and that product can then get swept into the water and can get taken across the rivers and into freshwater systems as well. So there's a slight difference there in the type of particle which is being produced from the fire, but yes, it can potentially be another contaminant which is going to be entering into, but this time the freshwater system. In general, I don't study that side of things, but there are people who are thinking about that, particularly in the wildland fire urban interface, so those fires which are close to where people are actually living.
Other questions? There was a student question over here.
Hi, Shani Trailer, Hui. This is probably mostly for Kara, but if anyone else has some thoughts, I'd love to hear them. So regarding the patchiness that you see with the methane release, I mean, in the Arctic in general, in the ocean in general, but in particular in that shelf, I'm a little bit curious if you have any thoughts about remote sensing or drone capabilities in that region, because I've seen a little bit from the terrestrial side of things that there are, you know, Sentinel-2, for example, has been used to look at methane leaks even on land. And I'm curious about that being applied to the ocean. I haven't seen very much of that, and I'm sure there are good reasons. But yeah, just kind of an ignorant question and curious to hear people's thoughts from the air-sea interaction space.
Yeah, great question. So I have not seen studies looking at drones like over the ocean specifically. I think that one of the challenges is definitely just the signal to noise ratio. So when I showed the data from the Thornton paper, that's continuous measurements, and I showed the flux results, if you look at the atmospheric concentration measurements, those are like, they are still seeing a very slight increase, but you know, it's like a few parts per billion kind of increase in methane over the seep. So there's definitely elevated methane, but it's a really small signal. So I think a lot of it comes down to what is the measurement capability of the sensor, and are we actually going to be able to distinguish? And I mean, the other thing I will say also is that the Arctic is just a very kind of politically challenging place to sample, as many of you know. So I was like, if I could, I would be like, the solution is let's just get rid of, like exclusive economic zones and everybody just goes where they want. Obviously, that's not realistic. And there's a lot of indigenous people in the Arctic, and it's important for local communities to have buy-in about who's sampling. So I think there needs to be a lot more collaboration to be able to apply these techniques in more locations so we can compare different regions. Question. If anybody else wants to jump in.
Hi, Suzanne Craig, NASA Goddard. These are kind of questions / comments, thoughts for both Kim and Douglas. I'm obviously very interested in PACE as part of the PACE team. So first of all, for Kim, you gave a beautiful talk today and told us about that very complex suite of VOCs and the potential to be formed into SOAs and CCNs. I wanted to think about the PACE data in two ways. Number one, as Douglas alluded to, PACE, we're hoping, is going to give us more insight into phytoplankton community composition. And there are currently science standard algorithms in production. And there's more coming down the pipeline as we get better at dealing with this data. So first of all, an appeal to Kim's community, and that is, can we work together to tease out the community composition that's responsible for producing these VOCs and potentially SOAs? So there's a really strong link there, and I kind of alluded to it in my little lightning talk. And then for Douglas, are you thinking also about the atmospheric products from PACE, or just the ocean color?
Yeah, so I mean, it would be great. We're all, we've been thinking about this for a while. I was sort of actually in your lightning talk, I was staring at your that it seemed to track the phytoplankton peak when you saw the secondary, we call them secondary marine aerosols, but SMA, they get their own name. And that sort of surprised me because we usually see a lag in when the secondary marine aerosols come out, because the phytoplankton, just as Farouk Azam taught me, the phytoplankton produce the food and the bacteria chew it up and get the smaller products, which are the gases, potentially, right? But we usually see the gases come out later and then oxidize. And then the data where you said, oh, it kind of looked like the correlation went away, it was actually peaking late. It was lagging.
It was peaking late, yeah, yeah.
And
so there's a lot to disentangle in there,
right,
yeah.
Right, so what I would say is, I don't know for the PACE people, because this is something I've been thinking about, it's the phytoplankton are one thing, for sure, that's part of it, but it's also bacteria and their communication and what they're doing, and if they're happy or sad or eating or whatever they're doing, right? Those bacteria are releasing a lot themselves. Will PACE give us any information on that part of the bio? This is just my own naive question for whoever doing this. I don't know.
They're a little too small to resolve.
That's what I thought. Even the big, I guess just.
But you know, by proxy, perhaps, by looking at the trophic state. And, if we know something about the how the phytoplankton and the associated microbial communities behave, and again, we talked about Kim Halsey's work, the disequilibrium kind of cycle between phytoplankton and bacteria, perhaps.
Okay, because I was just thinking that the example I was thinking of, and we can talk more later, but is like Rita Caldwell's work with a guy in Florida. I can't remember his name, but they're able to look down and sort of see where cholera is by ocean color. And so I'm thinking they can do it from they say they can. I'm just wondering if you could do that for different, and maybe in PACE should be even better. So anyway,
I mean, there's probably people that can talk better about public health proxies than I, but yeah, there are definite proxies that people use ocean color for.
Yep. Okay. Well, I have more questions for the audience, but anyway.
I just wanted to add on to that Kim Halsey is also looking at the impact of viral infection on VOCs from phytoplankton, and they're showing that is causing them to come out before the cells even lyse. So again, important that viruses are now being included in this discussion.
I'll be very quick with this one. So the satellites are wonderful in giving us an indication of the long-range transport of some of these aerosols, so things like fire plumes or dust plumes. But when we're interested in that deposition flux, that mass flux of how much iron or how much phosphorus, and particularly the bioavailable fraction of that, that's where we're kind of having to go back to the models to get those pieces of information. So I think it's great to use them both in tandem with each other to try and constrain the models further, but when we want that extra mass that's being transferred from the atmosphere to the ocean, and that's what we're pulling on the model information there. But definitely from the satellite point of view, where is the aerosol going? Are we getting that kind of transport, long-range transport suitably well?
Dave Kieber, I have a question for Luke. So you and others show these individual bubbles, but in fact, but I know you had a student working on it because I heard her at Ocean Science, interacting bubbles. So you have this plume of bubbles coming up, there's a layer. And I know from a point of view of aerosol production, and it's a very inefficient process of putting organics into the atmosphere. Most of it goes right back on the surface of the ocean. But for gas exchange, have you thought about how that might, the fact that there's interacting bubbles, how that affects gas exchange?
So we haven't quantified this at all. So all the model, like all the equations and models are sort of assuming that each bubble lives its own life. I mean, I've written full proposals on the corrective effects, and so I was sort of really trying to find them. And at the end of the day, you have enough uncertainty on many things that treating them individually is probably fine for all the dynamical things because it's not that dense. For the surface, you have some corrective effects that we see on the aerosol production. But I mean, there are probably subtle things happening collectively, but I don't think it's necessarily what we should chase first compared to all sorts of other complexity.
Other questions? Go to the side. I've been on
the other side for a while. Thanks, John Lauderdale, MIT. I guess this is a Yasser Douglas tag team. So the Pinatubo-induced El Nino that had a kind of, annual, interannual, small amount of carbon storage, does that also include a biogeochemical source of iron and other nutrients in the CESM? And I guess the second part of the question is that volcanoes are really messy, right? And there's lots of burning and lots of legacy, like puff creation and easily erodible material left over afterwards. So how do we go about including some of those longer term effects into Earth system models?
Yeah, good question. I tried to allude that towards the end with the industrial aerosol effects on oxygen consumption, but for volcanic eruptions, to my knowledge, I haven't seen any modeling studies that look at the global effect of iron deposition or other sources of micronutrients or macronutrients from explosive volcanic eruptions. There's been some observational studies that showed really clear, nice filaments of plankton trailing the deposition of some volcanoes in Alaska. But what is the global impact of a strong stratospheric penetrating volcanic eruption? I don't know. I think we can probably answer that with a global climate model experiment or maybe a back of the envelope maybe calculation first. But I did approach Keith Moore a while ago about doing something very similar to that. I think that's very much worth exploring. And then the second part of the question was on long-term impacts. Yeah, so from the iron deposition or nutrient deposition impacts, you'll get export and impacts on oxygen consumption at depth. From a climate impacts, we haven't really looked at the impacts on decadal variability associated with volcanic eruptions, and especially integrated impacts on climate for eruptions that occur close to each other. And I think Dave mentioned some of the tropospheric volcanic eruptions. They can differ quite a bit from the stratospheric penetrating eruptions, and that a lot of those aerosols stay in the troposphere. They impact shortwave irradiance. Those are very much worth simulating and exploring in a model context as well. So, yeah. I want to add one last thing on observations. I think the BGC Argo array now, being global, is extremely well suited to measure both climate and atmospheric deposition effects on biogeochemistry in ways that we haven't been able to do from satellite observations that only show you ocean colors. Argo would let us see what happens below the surface, and that's something that we're missing from an observational standpoint.
My name is Kyungmin from the Princeton University, and I have questions to the Douglas that how the model representations in the wildfire to ocean biogeochemistry interactions. So the current our system models have as air chemistries and ocean biogeochemistries all together. So then is this your cases of the wildfire interactions are represented in the models too? Or if not, then what is the limitations and what is the weak or how we develop the model to represent this kind of the interactions?
So the Earth system models, there's currently two, which do contain the nutrient cycling of wildfires. So all Earth system models, in fact, all climate models will contain a wildfire source because it's so important for the climate. So they're releasing black carbon, which is a very strong warming agent. They also have organic carbon, which is a scattering and cooling agent, and they are really very important for the cloud processing. So wildfires in general are represented in climate models, but take it to the next step to the biogeochemistry. There's currently two. There's the European one, and then there's the US one, and we're spending a lot of time developing those so that we can do this interaction between the atmosphere and the ocean, so that we can actually fully couple those and see what the impacts of not just wildfires, but also we've got dust in there with all of its nutrients and also anthropogenic activity, as well as producing nutrients to the aerosol, which are then being deposited to the ocean. So yes, we have got it. It is there, and we've been working on it for a while.
Other questions? These are great.
Masha Prokopenko from Pomona College. I have a question for Kara. So why is it so much more methane on the Russian side? Is it, I mean, is it, no, but is it this, are those the sediments? Is it the point why Russians want the Arctic, I guess? But is it the organic matter and the sediments ultimately?
Yeah, great question. So I had it as one of my bonus slides, but it's basically just showing the kind of the permafrost distribution in different portions of the Arctic. And the unique thing about the Russian side of the Arctic is that they have a really, really broad and shallow continental shelf. So there's a lot more like surface area for there to be permafrost and like organic rich sediments, whereas most of the North American Arctic, the shelf is much narrower. Kind of when you're in like the Chukchi Bering, it's wider, but then as soon as you go towards the east, it's narrower. So there's just a lot more like really shallow surface area there potentially that could be allowing this benthic flux to make it to the atmosphere. But currently, just because the data is so limited, we don't have a very good mechanistic understanding. So that's just kind of the hypothesis right now is that like in some of the Shakova papers, they were really focused on really shallow waters, and we would expect there to be a higher flux from the benthic, from the sediments there compared to as soon as you go deeper. I know there's also been some studies, Katie Sparrow led one of them kind of on the north slope of Alaska. So similar like permafrost, shallow shelf there. And they kind of saw a difference that like once you go past about 20 or 30 meters, you weren't really seeing much of that sedimentary methane making it to the atmosphere. So I think part of it, what we still need to understand is, how the flux is very spatially. So that's why I think that getting more of these studies really going from the terrestrial system all the way kind of offshore would be really useful to better quantify that gradient, because a lot of the uncertainty right now is in how you upscale. Because if there's orders of magnitude differences in fluxes, depending on how abundant you assume those hotspots are, is really going to change your flux, right? So.
Kara, are the methane oxidation rates measured in the areas you've been working at, and are they high enough to explain the fact that you don't see methane making it to the surface?
Yeah, great question. So there's definitely been some studies of methane oxidation. I don't think that there's been much in the on the Russian side. So that's something that I think needs to be done more because it's definitely dependent on the region, but even though the rates are lower because the temperature is colder, there is still, like, you can measure rates of methane oxidation. I know Bryce Luce is in the audience. He's done oxidation rates in ours. They're definitely measurable, so it's definitely happening. So I think it's just a question of if that water can stay isolated from the mix layer, like if it makes up to the mix layer, it's going to flux to the atmosphere, but if it stays below the surface for long enough, that's time for methane or microbes to oxidize.
Yeah, this question is for Luke. Tim DeVries at Santa Barbara. So your new parameterizations are really nice. I think they'll be standard pretty soon. One thing I wonder about is the scaling with the significant wave height. If you have regions where the waves are not locally generated, I suppose those waves might not contribute to air sea fluxes. Or are there ways to improve that parameterization in that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think what's nice with this formulation is that you have a single wave variable that captures some of that, and that means that it's fairly easy to get significant wave height now. I mean, and it's going to be easier as time goes on with more satellite products and stuff. So that's sort of that's why we have been sort of sticking with that parameter. If you go to the wave community, they don't really like that I use significant wave height because it's not precise enough, right? It doesn't really get you the high frequency part of the spectrum in the best way. So if you go through the papers, there are actually two formulations. One uses the full wave spectrum and uses the mean square slope, so the high frequency part of the wave signal, and then the other one is like shortcutting a lot of information to the significant wave height. So you can address your question by having a full wave model that's going to properly resolve the sheltered region or better resolve the sheltered region. And then you could also do like a machine learning exercise where you take a full model and you cook up a formulation that uses more than one variable, then not just significant wave height, but significant wave height plus one or two other parameters that you could realize. So you have ways to do that, and it might be important locally. It might change things locally, but yeah, we haven't done it.
And that was our buzzer to end this session. So let's thank our speakers one more time.